Welcome to another quiet journey into the past. Tonight we will travel back many centuries, to the long, cold winters of medieval Europe. The picture we often imagine is one of endless snow, icy winds, and poor peasants shivering in fragile cottages. It might seem impossible that they could survive such conditions without electricity, central heating, or warm winter jackets. But the truth is both surprising and comforting. These people, though they lived lives very different from ours, were remarkably clever about staying warm. This story is not one of warriors, kings, or battles. Instead, it is about everyday people, the ones who worked the land, raised families, and built homes with their own hands. By walking slowly through their lives, we can learn how they survived, how they adapted, and how their communities were designed for warmth and resilience. So settle in, put on your blanket, light a candle, if you have one, and let the soft sound of history keep you company. As you listen, imagine yourself resting by a hearth in a simple medieval cottage, with the cold winter night just outside the door. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you are tuning in from. In the Taititsi next episode, your name may be mentioned as part of our quiet community of listeners. Now, let us begin with the most basic question. How did they not simply freeze to death? Ever wondered why medieval peasants didn't just freeze to death during those bone-chilling winters? Imagine yourself in a small village around the year 1300. The air is sharp, your breath is visible, and frost clings to the ground like a sheet of silver. You might expect everyone to be huddled in misery, waiting for spring to save them. But that was not the case. Medieval peasants had an entire toolkit of strategies, shaped by generations of trial and error, to stay alive and even reasonably comfortable. First, remember that they did not have the things we take for granted. No heated blankets, no hot water bottles, no radiators humming in the night. Their cottages had no insulation in the way we understand it today, and yet they worked surprisingly well. The trick lay in design, materials, and daily habits that made the most of limited resources. Think about the hearth, the center of the home. It was more than a fire for cooking. It was a constant companion, a source of light, heat, and security. Families gathered close to it, not only to warm their hands, but also to share news, songs, and quiet companionship. Heat from the fire spread through the space, combining with the warmth of bodies and even animals to lift the temperature enough to keep frostbite at bay. But it was not only the fire that kept them safe. The peasants' houses themselves were built with clever features to hold on to what little heat they produced. Low ceilings prevented warmth from rising too far above where people sat and slept. Tiny windows stopped drafts from stealing away precious heat. Thick walls, made from layers of clay, straw, and wood, trapped warmth while still letting the building breathe. Daily life itself was designed around warmth. People wore layers of wool clothing, slept close together, and often lived side by side with animals, whose body heat added to the temperature. Food was planned to be hot and filling, with stews simmering slowly over the fire. And when even all of this was not enough, the community stepped in, sharing resources and duties to make sure no one froze alone. So the answer to why they did not freeze to death is simple, yet impressive. They combined intelligent design, clever use of natural materials, and a deep sense of community. Their survival was not a lucky accident, but the result of careful planning passed down across generations. As we continue, we will look more closely at their houses, their schedules, and the ways they adapted to every corner of winter life. For now, picture yourself stepping inside a small medieval cottage. The smell of smoke is heavy in the air. The light is dim, but the warmth of the fire and the closeness of the family make it a shelter against the cold world outside. Let's talk about their houses first. When you first imagine a medieval peasant's home, you might picture a shaky wooden shack, thin walls, and a roof that leaked at the first sign of rain. It is easy to assume that people simply endured the cold, teeth chattering until spring returned. But archaeology and careful study show us something different. These cottages were not careless constructions. They were carefully designed to keep out the cold as best as possible. One of the most important features was the way many houses were partly dug into the ground. They were not caves, but they used the same natural principle that underground spaces: remain at a more stable temperature. By sinking the floor 2 or 3 feet into the earth, the house gained a layer of natural insulation. In summer, it kept the home cool. In winter, it kept the frost away. You can think of it like building inside a shallow bowl, where the walls of soil help shelter you from the wind. Archaeologists have uncovered examples of these sunken featured buildings, sometimes called Grubenhäuser. The name sounds technical, but the idea is simple. A lowered floor meant the coldest winds swept over the roof instead of through the room. Inside, the temperature could be several degrees warmer than outside, which may not sound like much, but in survival terms, every degree mattered. The roofs of these houses were thatched, which means covered with tightly packed bundles of straw or reeds. A good thatch roof could be surprisingly strong and water resistant. The angled design let snow slide off quickly, while the thickness trapped warmth inside. People today may think straw would be flimsy, but tests on reconstructed houses show that thick thatch is an excellent insulator, much like a heavy quilt spread across the top of the building. Windows, when they existed at all, were very small. Often, they were no bigger than a person's head, just wide enough to let in a little daylight. Glass was far too expensive for peasants, so openings were sometimes covered with oiled cloth, thin horn, or even wooden shutters. This meant the houses were dim inside, but it also meant they did not lose valuable heat. A bright home was less important than a warm one. The walls themselves were made using a method called wattle and daub. Imagine weaving thin sticks together like a giant basket. That was the wattle. Then, over this frame, peasants smeared daub, a mixture of clay, soil, straw, and sometimes even animal dung. It may sound unpleasant to us, but this mixture dried into a solid, sturdy wall that trapped heat inside. When fresh cracks appeared, they could be patched with more daub before winter began, keeping out drafts. Floors were usually packed earth, sometimes covered with straw to make them softer and a little warmer underfoot. In some homes, wooden planks were laid down. They were not polished or smooth, but they lifted people away from the damp soil. Over time, the straw and floor coverings built up into layers, which actually added more insulation. Because most peasant homes were a single room, all activities took place in the same space. Cooking, eating, sleeping, and working were done together. At first, this might sound cramped, but there was a hidden advantage. A single room meant the fire warmed everything at once. There was no need to heat separate chambers. Body heat from the family and even their animals added to the warmth. In the long, cold nights of January, this closeness could mean the difference between comfort and misery. Another clever detail was the low ceiling. Modern houses often have high ceilings, which makes rooms feel open and airy. But in a medieval cottage, a high ceiling would have been wasteful. Heat naturally rises, and if the roof was too high, warmth would drift above the heads of the family, leaving them in the cold. By keeping the roofline low, peasants kept the warmth where they needed it most. Taken together, these features created homes that were far from fragile. They were earthy, dim, and smoky, but they worked. Archaeologists who have reconstructed such houses and measured their temperatures in winter have found that they could maintain an indoor climate 10 degrees warmer than outside. To us, that still sounds chilly, but for people dressed in layers of wool and huddled by the fire, it was enough to survive. So, while medieval peasant cottages may not look impressive to modern eyes, they were carefully engineered. They combined natural materials, simple design, and centuries of trial and error to create homes that shielded families from the cruelest weather. Imagine yourself stepping down into such a house on a frosty evening. The doorway is narrow, the air is thick with smoke, and the light from the hearth glows against the daub walls. Outside, the wind howls across the open fields, but inside, the earth itself wraps around you, steady and protective. It is not luxury, but it is survival, built into every detail. Tiny windows and low ceilings You may have heard someone in your own house complain about energy loss when a door is left open in winter. Imagine that idea taken to the extreme, and you have the medieval peasant home. Every part of the building was designed to conserve heat because any little draft could undo all the hard work of keeping warm. The windows were one of the first sacrifices. For most peasant homes, there were no wide views of the outside world. Instead, the windows were narrow openings, sometimes no larger than a person's head. They let in just enough daylight to see by, and nothing more. Without glass panes, the openings would have been drafty, so shutters or oiled cloth were often used to cover them. This kept wind and rain out while trapping heat inside. It made the cottage darker, of course. Most of the time, the main source of light was the fire itself, glowing and flickering at the center of the room. But darkness was accepted as part of life. A bright, sunny room was less important than one that held its warmth. Ceilings, too, were built with heat in mind. Unlike modern homes that often value space and airiness, medieval cottages had low roofs. This kept the heat down near the floor, where families lived and slept. Warm air naturally rises, and with a tall ceiling, much of the fire's energy would have been wasted. By lowering the roofline, they kept every degree of warmth closer to their bodies. The size of the home itself was another factor. Instead of spreading out into multiple rooms, peasant families shared a single large space. At first, this might seem uncomfortable, but it was efficient. A single fire could heat the whole room. Family members, crowded together, added their own warmth to the air. Even the animals, often brought indoors during the coldest nights, helped keep the temperature steady. It may sound strange to us, but being close together was not just practical. It was also part of the rhythm of their lives. Children, parents, and sometimes grandparents all shared the same space, hearing the same fire crackle and breathing the same smoky air. Warmth was a shared experience, not an individual luxury. There is something striking about this idea. In the modern world, we think of warmth as something each person controls, adjusting a thermostat or wrapping in their own blanket. In medieval Europe, warmth was a collective thing. You stayed warm because the house was small, the windows were shut tight, and everyone shared the same close space. So when we picture these cottages, it is important to remember that their simplicity had a purpose. Tiny windows, low ceilings, and close quarters may not seem appealing to us, but they were deliberate choices. Each one kept families alive when the nights grew long and the frost crept across the land. Imagine yourself in such a room. The fire glows in the center, shadows dance on the daub walls, and the ceiling feels close above your head. Outside, the world is frozen and still, but inside, the careful design of the home holds warmth where it is most needed. Wattle and daub, the walls of survival. Now that we have stepped inside the cottage, let us look closely at its walls. They may appear simple, but they were crafted with methods that were both clever and practical. The technique most commonly used was called wattle and daub, and while the name may sound strange, the system was surprisingly effective. First came the wattle. This was a framework made by weaving thin branches, twigs, or reeds together. Think of it as a giant basket turned upright. The woven pattern gave the wall flexibility and strength, creating a surface that could hold the next layer. Then came the daub. This was a mixture of earth, clay, straw, and often animal dung. Yes, dung was part of the recipe because it acted as a natural binding material. The mixture was pressed and smeared into the gaps of the wattle, filling the spaces until the whole wall was sealed. Once it dried, the result was solid, thick, and surprisingly warm. To us today, it may sound unappealing to live surrounded by walls that contained manure, but for medieval peasants, it was simply practical. All the materials were free and available. Clay and soil came from the ground under their feet. Straw was left over from the harvest. Animal dung was plentiful, and rather than being waste, it became part of the building itself. Nothing was wasted when survival was the goal. What is most impressive is that these walls worked. Experiments with reconstructed wattle and daub houses show that they could insulate nearly as well as some modern building materials. They were thick enough to hold in heat, yet breathable, which helped prevent dampness and mold from building up inside. A well-maintained wall could last for decades, and when cracks appeared, they could easily be patched with a fresh layer of daub. The walls also helped in other ways. Because they were made of natural materials, they blended smoothly with the environment. In winter, their thick surfaces acted as insulation. In summer, they kept the interior cooler. In a sense, they regulated the living space naturally, something that modern heating and cooling systems now do artificially. There was also a rhythm to maintaining these walls. Each autumn, before the cold set in, families would inspect the daub, looking for any places where wind or frost might creep through. Fresh layers were applied where needed, often mixed and pressed by hand. Children would sometimes help in this task, stomping the mixture together with bare feet until it reached the right consistency. So, while the walls may have looked plain, from the outside, they were one of the most important defenses against the cold. Without them, the fire's warmth would have been lost quickly. With them, the cottage became a cocoon of survival, keeping life safe inside while winter howled beyond the door. The next time you see a smooth plaster wall or a layer of paint, you might remember that once, walls were alive with clay, straw, and the work of human hands. They were not only barriers, but blankets wrapped around families as they slept through the frozen nights. Imagine yourself leaning against such a wall. It feels rough beneath your hand, smelling faintly of earth and straw. You hear the faint crackle of the fire inside, while the frost taps softly against the shuttered window. The wall stands steady, a silent companion keeping the warmth close. The hearth, heart of the homestep, further into a medieval peasant's cottage, and your eyes will quickly be drawn to the center. There, glowing with steady flames and sending smoke curling toward the roof, is the hearth. This was far more than just a fireplace. It was the beating heart of the home, the single feature around which daily life revolved. The hearth had many jobs at once. It cooked every meal, from bubbling stews to simple bread. It gave light when the sun set, casting flickering shadows against the walls. It kept families warm when frost lay thick outside. And beyond these physical needs, it was also the place where people gathered to talk, sing, and share stories. In modern terms, you could say it was their heater, their kitchen, and their social media all at the same time. Unlike the fireplaces you may know today, many peasant hearths were simple, open fires set on a stone base in the middle of the floor. There was no chimney in the early centuries, only a hole or vent in the roof to let out smoke. This meant the air inside was often hazy, stinging the eyes and clinging to clothing. Yet the smoke itself served a purpose. It helped preserve the thatch roof above, protecting it from insects and rot. In this way, even the discomfort of smoke became part of survival. The heat from the hearth was not always intense, but it was steady. Archaeologists who have studied reconstructed cottages suggest that a well-tended fire could keep the interior around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even when outside temperatures dropped far below freezing. To us today, that might still feel cold, but with layers of wool clothing and shared body heat, it was enough. Families organized their daily routines around the fire. Meals were prepared slowly, often in large pots that hung over the flames. These pots simmered for hours, turning whatever ingredients were available into thick, filling stews. The fire never went out if it could be helped, because relighting it was difficult. Keeping the coals alive through the night was an important responsibility, often passed down from parents to children as part of household training. The hearth was also a place of gathering. In the dark winter evenings, when work outside had ended and the cold pressed in, families sat close to the fire. Children listened to stories, adults shared news, and sometimes songs or prayers filled the smoky air. It was a time of connection, a rhythm repeated day after day, night after night, through the long months of winter. To us, the idea of one fire heating an entire home may sound fragile, but it was enough. Combined with clever house design, insulated, walls and thick clothing. The hearth kept people alive. It was not comfort in the modern sense, but it was warmth, steady and reliable. Imagine yourself sitting near such a fire. The flames crackle softly, sparks drift upward, and the smoke curls above your head. The walls around you glow in the flickering light, while the wind outside rattles the shutters in vain. The hearth is more than fire. It is survival, a constant flame holding back the cold world beyond. More than warmth, the hearth is a gathering place. The hearth did more than keep out the cold. It was also the center of social life inside the cottage. In fact, you could almost think of it as the medieval version of the living room, kitchen, and local cafe combined. In the glow of the fire, meals were cooked and shared. A pot of pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and vegetables, often bubbled for days at a time. Families added new ingredients as they became available, so the stew was never quite the same from one day to the next. The heat of the fire kept the food safe to eat, and its warmth filled stomachs as well as the air. Eating near the hearth was not just convenient, it was comforting. But food was only one part of its importance. The hearth was also where stories were told. Parents and grandparents passed down tales of saints, heroes, and local legends, while children listened closely, their faces lit by the flicker of the flames. Gossip too was shared here. Who had been seen with whom, which field had been damaged, or what the lord of the manor had demanded this week. These conversations all circled around the warmth of the fire. There was no better place to spend the long winter evenings. The smoke curled gently toward the roof. The firewood popped and crackled, and the faint glow painted patterns on the daub walls. For families who had little in the way of possessions, the fire itself was wealth. It gave not only heat and light, but also a sense of connection and safety. Archaeological studies of peasant homes from the 1300s suggest that a central hearth could keep the room at a temperature of about 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. To us, that may sound cool, but to people dressed in wool tunics, cloaks, and hoods, it was almost comfortable. After working in fields chilled by frost, stepping into such warmth felt like relief. To them, it was nearly tropical. Even the placement of the hearth had meaning. By sitting in the center of the home, it spread warmth evenly and gave everyone a place around which to gather. Its light reached into every corner of the single room. At night, when the wind howled outside, the glowing hearth reassured the family that they were safe and cared for. So when we think of medieval winter life, we should not only imagine hardship, we should also imagine the quiet evenings, families huddled together, telling stories and sharing food while the fire kept the night at bay. It was not luxury, but it was warmth, both physical and emotional. Picture yourself now sitting on a wooden stool beside that hearth. The flickering light touches your hands, and you hear the low hum of voices around you. Beyond the door, frost covers the ground. But here inside, in the heart of the cottage, the hearth holds everything together. Houses designed for survival. When we look at a medieval peasant's home from the outside, it might seem small and plain. But every part of its design served a purpose, especially in winter. These were not random huts thrown together. They were survival machines, carefully shaped by generations who knew the dangers of cold. Sleeping areas were one of the first considerations. Families placed their bedding far from drafts, usually away from the door and close to the warmest parts of the cottage. Some beds were set slightly above the floor, raised on wooden frames or platforms. This kept sleepers away from the damp ground and closer to the rising heat of the hearth. Straw and wool stuffed into mattresses trapped warmth, and sometimes even animals were kept nearby to add to the comfort. Roofs too were built with winter in mind. A steep pitch allowed snow to slide off quickly. If snow was allowed to build up, it could collapse a weaker structure. But the angled thatched roofs of peasant homes were designed to shed weight and keep the roof dry. The thick thatch worked like a natural insulator, holding heat in during the cold months and resisting wind that howled across open fields. The orientation of the house was also important. Many cottages were built to take advantage of the sun's path. Windows, small as they were, often faced toward the low winter sun, allowing precious light and warmth to enter. Even a little sunlight through the shutter or cloth covering could make the difference between comfort and discomfort during the shortest days of the year. Doorways were narrow and sometimes angled to block direct wind. Some homes even had small entry spaces that worked like simple windbreaks. This meant cold air could not rush straight into the living area whenever the door was opened. Every small detail helped preserve the warmth inside. We might be tempted to see these features as ordinary, but together they made the house an effective shelter. They show us that medieval peasants were not helpless against the weather. They adapted their homes in ways that were simple, practical, and reliable. Think of the cottage as a kind of handmade shield. The walls of wattle and daub kept drafts away. The steep roof kept snow at bay. The low ceiling held heat close, and the placement of beds and animals made sure no warmth was wasted. It was a full system, designed with care and tested by centuries of hard winters. Now picture yourself lying on a straw bed tucked into the corner of such a house. The fire glows faintly, the roof above is heavy with thatch, and the wind outside whistles but cannot break through. Every part of the house works, quietly, holding warmth, guiding light, and keeping you safe through the night. Smoke as both problem and protection. One of the first things you would notice if you stepped into a medieval peasant's home is the smoke. With no proper chimney in most cottages, the fire's fumes filled the room before finding their way out, through small holes in the roof or through the thatch itself. To modern eyes, this seems awful. You might cough, your eyes would sting, and your clothes would smell like wood smoke for days. Yet, strange as it sounds, that smoke actually helped peasants survive. For one, it kept in more warmth. Without a wide chimney to let the heat escape, much of it stayed trapped in the house along with the smoke. The air was hazy, but it was also warmer. Families learned to live with it by keeping close to the floor where the smoke was thinner and the heat more comfortable. Smoke also served another purpose. It preserved the roof. Thatched roofs could become infested with insects, birds, or even start to rot if they stayed too damp. But constant smoke drifting upward through the thatch worked like a natural disinfectant. It dried the straw, kept pests away, and made the roof last longer. In other words, the discomfort of smoky air was a trade-off for a stronger home. There was even a health advantage in small doses. Some studies suggest that smoky environments can help reduce insects like fleas and lice, which spread disease. While smoke might irritate lungs, it may also have offered some protection from worse problems. Families accepted the sting in their eyes if it meant fewer pests in their bedding. Children grew up used to it. Their eyes watered at first, but soon they learned to sit low, near the warmth of the fire, but away from the thickest part of the haze. Adults sometimes built wooden platforms or simple lofts under the roof, and while these were smoky, they were also warm sleeping spots. People balanced comfort against survival. So while the smoke of a medieval hearth may sound like a nuisance, it was also a silent ally. It kept out biting cold, preserved the roof overhead, and even fought off pests that would otherwise make life miserable. Now imagine yourself sitting on a stool, blinking against the smoke curling in the dim air. You cough a little, your eyes water, but then you feel the steady warmth of the fire against your hands. Outside, the frost is sharp and the night long, but inside the smoky cottage you are alive, protected, and able to last another winter night. Beds, blankets, and body heat. For medieval peasants, the bedroom was not a private, silent place. Instead, it was a shared space where warmth meant survival. In the coldest months of winter, families often slept together in the same bed or in close groups on straw mattresses spread across the floor. This was not only about closeness or comfort, it was a clever way to use body heat to stay alive. Straw bedding was the most common choice. Peasants stuffed it into large sacks of linen or wool. or simply piled loose straw in a corner and covered it with cloth. Straw acted as insulation, trapping heat while lifting sleepers off the cold, damp ground. Over time, it would flatten, attract bugs and need replacing, but during those first weeks it made a noticeable difference. Wool blankets were treasured items. If a family was lucky enough to own a thick wool cover, it became one of the most valuable possessions in the house. Wool naturally traps warmth even when damp, making it perfect for the long, humid winters of medieval Europe. Poorer families, who could not afford much wool, relied on patched blankets or layered old clothing as makeshift covers. Sleeping together was the key. Parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents huddled together under the same cover. The heat of several bodies under one blanket created a microclimate that kept everyone warmer than if they slept apart. In some cases, animals like dogs or even lambs might be brought in to add extra heat at night. This closeness shaped family life. People were used to hearing snores, coughs, and murmured words in their sleep. Privacy was minimal, but warmth mattered, more than comfort. Some families even had box beds, wooden frames with sliding panels that enclosed the sleeping area like a little cupboard. These trapped body heat extremely well and kept out drafts. Think about lying in one of those crowded beds. You hear the crackle of the fire, the low breathing of your family beside you, the weight of a wool blanket pressing down. It is warm in the small circle under the covers, while outside, the frost grips the earth. You are sharing not just a bed, but the energy that keeps everyone alive through the night. Animals as living heaters. One of the cleverest tricks medieval peasants used to survive winter was sharing their living space with animals. Today, the idea of sleeping a few feet away from a cow or goat might sound unpleasant, but for peasants, animals were more than food and work partners. They were also living heaters that gave off steady warmth through the night. Many peasant cottages were built in a simple style, where one half was for people and the other half for animals. A low wall, wooden partition, or even just a raised step separated the spaces. At night, cows, sheep, goats, or pigs would be brought indoors. Their body heat radiated into the small home, making the air noticeably warmer than it would have been. Otherwise, cows in particular were valuable winter companions. A single cow gives off a surprising amount of heat, and in a tiny house that mattered. Chickens kept in coops near the hearth added not only warmth, but also a small supply of fresh eggs during the season when food was scarce. Even dogs and cats served as little bundles of warmth, curling up on straw beds beside their owners. This arrangement was not purely for comfort. Keeping animals inside also protected them from predators and harsh weather. A cow left outdoors in bitter frost might sicken or die, which would mean disaster for a peasant family relying on milk or labor in the fields. By sharing their homes, peasants preserved both themselves and their livestock. Of course, there were drawbacks. The smell of manure, the noise of animals shifting in the night, and the constant work of cleaning made life crowded and messy. Yet, peasants accepted this because survival outweighed discomfort. For them, the warmth of a cow in winter could mean the difference between life and death. Imagine waking in the middle of a frosty night. The fire has burned low, the smoke hangs in the air, and your blanket feels thin. But in the next space, you hear the quiet breathing of a cow, the rustle of a sheep, the soft cluck of a chicken. Their warmth drifts across the small cottage, mixing with yours, creating a shared heat that pushes back the freezing dark outside. Food and drink for inner warmth. Staying warm in the Middle Ages was not only about fires, blankets, and body heat. It also depended on what peasants ate and drank. Their diets may seem plain to us, but the foods they relied on gave them the energy needed to push through freezing days. Bread was at the heart of everything. In winter, thick loaves made from rye, barley, or oats filled stomachs and provided slow-burning energy. These breads were heavy, dense, and sometimes sour, but they were fuel. Bread was often eaten with pottage, a kind of thick stew made by boiling grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were stored from autumn. Turnips, leeks, and cabbages lasted well in cool storage pits, so they often appeared in the pot. Protein also played a role. Peasants could not eat meat often, but when a pig was slaughtered in late autumn, the meat was salted or smoked so it could last through winter. Small portions were added to pottage or eaten on special days, giving warmth and strength. Dairy, products like cheese and butter were more common, and they provided fat that helped people endure the cold. Warm drinks were important too. Ale was the most common, drunk by adults and children alike because water was often unsafe. Ale was usually weak, but still provided calories and warmth when consumed hot. Some households also drank warmed milk or broth, both of which comforted the body on icy nights. Even spices, rare though they were for peasants, had a place in warmth. A little mustard or garlic added heat to meals. Wealthier peasants who could access imported spices sometimes used cinnamon or ginger, which were believed to warm the body from within. Food was not just about hunger, it was survival fuel. Eating hearty bread and hot pottage before bed made it easier to sleep through a freezing night. A mug of warm ale or broth might take the edge off the cold and give energy for the morning's work. Picture yourself finishing a steaming bowl of pottage in a smoky cottage. The stew is simple, filled with grains and root vegetables, maybe flavored with a scrap of salted pork. You wash it down with a sip of warm ale. Soon your body feels steadier, stronger, and ready to face the frost outside. Layer upon layer, medieval clothing. Clothing was just as important as fires and food when it came to surviving winter. Peasants could not afford the luxurious furs and fine fabrics worn by lords, but they made clever use of the materials available to them. The secret was layering, using several simple garments to trap heat close to the body. The base layer was usually a linen shirt or shift. Linen was light and could be washed more easily than wool, so it acted as the layer against the skin. Over this, peasants wore woolen tunics, hose, and cloaks. Wool was the main defense against the cold. It was thick, naturally insulating, and even stayed warm when damp. Outer garments like cloaks or mantles were vital. These were often fastened with a simple clasp or pinned at the shoulder. A heavy wool cloak could double as a blanket at night, making it one of the most useful possessions in a household. Head and hands needed protection too. A woolen hood, sometimes with a long tail called a liripipe, covered the head and neck. Gloves were rarer for peasants, but mittens made from scraps of wool or leather were sometimes worn. Feet were covered with simple leather shoes stuffed with moss, straw, or scraps of cloth to provide insulation. Fur, though expensive, sometimes found its way into peasant clothing. Rabbit skins or sheepskins might be sewn into cloaks or used as linings for boots. Wealthier peasants might trade for bits of squirrel or goat fur to add extra warmth. Clothing was not changed often, especially in winter. Many peasants wore the same wool tunic day after day, sleeping in it at night, and adding extra layers only when the weather turned bitter. Though heavy and sometimes itchy, the layers kept them alive. Imagine stepping outside on a frosty morning. You are wrapped in a rough wool cloak, your hood pulled low over your face. Your shoes crunch on the frozen ground, and your breath rises in clouds. The fabric is scratchy and smells of smoke from the hearth, but you are warm enough to work in. The fields. Without these layers, the cold would bite straight into your bones. Winter food, feasts, and famine clothing kept the cold out, but food kept life going. In winter, food was not simply about filling the belly, it was a constant test of survival. Unlike today, when shops overflow with fruit and vegetables year-round, medieval peasants faced a long, hungry stretch between late autumn and early spring when very little grew. What you ate in winter depended on what you had managed to grow, preserve, or store earlier in the year. For many families, this meant the difference between making it to spring or facing starvation. The hungry gap of the hardest times of the year was what people called the hungry gap. This period usually fell between January and April. By then, the stored grains and vegetables from the last harvest were running low, but the new crops had not yet ripened. The garden was bare, the fields were sleeping, and the livestock had grown thin from poor winter grazing. The hungry gap meant smaller meals, more watery stews, and, in the worst years, empty bellies. Families stretched food as far as it could go. Children might be given only thin broth, while parents quietly went hungry. Hunger was not an occasional visitor in medieval winters, it was a regular companion. Preserving the harvest's survival through winter depended on how well a family had preserved food in autumn. Drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting were essential techniques. Without them, food would rot long before it was needed. Grains like barley, rye, and oats were stored in sacks or bins, carefully guarded against dampness and rodents. These grains were the backbone of peasant diets, baked into coarse bread or boiled into thick porridge. Bread was not just food, it was life. To run out of grain was to face disaster. Vegetables like onions, leeks, and cabbages were hardy enough to last through cold months if stored in cellars or buried in pits lined with straw. Beans and peas could be dried and rehydrated later in stews. Fruits such as apples and pears were dried or turned into cider. Meat, a rare treat for peasants, was salted or smoked so that it could last for months. The role of pottage day after day, the main meal of peasants was pottage, a thick soup or stew cooked in a large pot that hung over the fire. Pottage was endlessly adaptable. In summer, it might be rich with herbs and fresh vegetables. In winter, it was often little more than grains boiled in water, with a few dried peas or scraps of salted meat thrown in. The pot of pottage was usually kept going for days at a time. New ingredients were added whenever available, while the older contents boiled down to mush. This perpetual stew provided warmth as well as nourishment, and even a thin pottage could keep people alive. Salt, the treasure of winter salt, was one of the most valuable commodities in the medieval world. It preserved meat, fish, and dairy products, and without it, survival in winter was nearly impossible. Wealthy households bought imported salt in bulk, but peasants relied on local sources if they were lucky enough to live near salt springs or coastal salt pans. Salted herring, in particular, was a winter staple. It was cheap, transportable, and kept for months in barrels. Whole villages might subsist on salted fish through Lent, the long religious fasting season that overlapped with the hungry gap. Animals in the lean months' livestock provided food, but winter was hard on animals too. Cows produced less milk, and hens laid fewer eggs when days were short. Families often slaughtered animals in late autumn, when grazing grew scarce, then salted or smoked the meat for winter. Fresh meat was rare by January, and by February, almost non-existent. What little remained was fatty bacon or dried strips of beef. Bones were boiled for broth, and no scrap was wasted. Even blood was used to make dishes like black pudding before it spoiled. Festive food in winter. Not all was bleak. Winter did bring a few occasions for feasting. Christmas and the Feast of Epiphany were celebrated with whatever luxuries a household could muster. A pig might be slaughtered, bread baked from finer wheat flour, or ale brewed a little stronger. Even peasants tried to make the holiday special, though their celebrations were humbler than those of nobles. Sharing food with neighbors was part of the tradition. A family with little might still be invited to join a larger feast, reinforcing community bonds at a time when survival depended on cooperation. These rare feasts lit up the long, dark months and gave people something to look forward to: starvation and desperation. Yet the truth is that not every family survived winter unscathed. In years of poor harvest, famine could spread quickly. People might be forced to eat foods normally considered animal feed, such as acorns or rough bran mixed with flour. Stories survive of desperate people boiling weeds, bark, or even shoe leather. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable, and villages sometimes lost many of their weakest members before spring. These losses were mourned, but also expected. In a sense, winter was a natural filter, testing every household's preparation and resilience. Drink in the cold months alongside food. Drink was equally important. Water was often unsafe, so ale and cider were the daily drinks. Brewing ale was a way to preserve grain in liquid form, and it provided calories as well as hydration. Ale in winter was usually weak and sour, but it was safer than stagnant water. In some regions, warmed ale or spiced wine was enjoyed during festivals, offering both comfort and heat. For most peasants, though, winter drink was the same as summer. Thin ale or watered-down cider, consumed morning, noon, and night. A winter's table picture, a family gathered around a rough wooden table in January. The room is dim, lit only by the fire. In the pot hangs a pottage made of barley and beans, flavoured with a tiny piece of salted pork. The children slurp the warm broth eagerly, though there is little solid food inside. A heel of coarse bread is passed around, each person taking a small piece. Beside the pot, a jug of weak ale waits to be poured. It is not a feast. It is not even fully satisfying. Yet it is hot, filling, and enough to keep hunger at bay for another night. Food as hope more than anything. Food in winter was tied to hope. Each bowl of pottage was a step towards spring. Each salted fish a reminder of the summer catch. Each crust of bread a sign that the harvest had not yet run out. Eating was not simply an act of pleasure. It was a prayer for survival. The rhythm of medieval life was ruled by seasons, and in no season was that more clear than in winter. Every bite carried the weight of preparation, fortune, and faith. To reach spring with enough food left was a triumph, celebrated as much as the blossoming of flowers or the return of birds, winter chores and the rhythm of survival. When you imagine medieval winter, it is easy to picture peasants sitting idly by the fire, waiting for spring. The truth was different. Winter did not mean rest. It meant survival work. Though fields lay frozen and harvests were months away, peasants still had long lists of tasks that could not be ignored. These jobs kept families alive, and they also kept the rhythm of rural life moving forward. Less daylight, slower pace. The first change winter brought was shorter days. In December, the sun might rise after 8 in the morning and vanish by 4 in the afternoon. Without artificial light, work hours shrank. Candles and oil lamps existed, but they were costly, so peasants relied mostly on daylight and firelight. This meant people woke with the dawn, worked until dusk, and then gathered around the hearth. Winter was a season of early nights, but even in dim cottages people found ways to keep busy. Mending, repairing, and making winter was the season of mending. Clothes, tools, and household items all wore out during the busy farming months, and winter was the time to fix them. Women spun wool or flax into thread, which could be woven into cloth for clothing. Men repaired carts, ploughs, and wooden handles for tools. Shoes were patched, baskets rewoven, ropes twisted, and nets repaired. Nothing was thrown away if it could be fixed. Winter was the medieval version of a repair shop, with every family member playing a part. Spinning and weaving. One of the most important winter tasks was spinning. Wool from sheep sheared in summer had to be cleaned, carded, and spun into yarn. Spinning wheels were rare until the late Middle Ages, so most women spun with simple spindles, twisting thread by hand. Spinning was slow, repetitive, and could be done by firelight, making it perfect for long evenings indoors. The yarn would later be woven into cloth for clothing, bedding, or even sacks. Children learned to spin early, so winter evenings often hummed with the soft sound of thread being made. Brewing and baking food preparation never stopped, even in winter. Brewing ale was a constant chore, since ale spoiled quickly and had to be made fresh every week or two. Brewing was usually done by women. The process filled the house with warm steam and the smell of malted grain, which was a comfort in cold weather. Baking bread was another routine job. Many villages had communal ovens, and families took turns baking. Bread was baked in large batches to last several days, and though coarse and hard, it was the foundation of every meal. Animal care livestock could not be ignored in winter. Cows, sheep, goats, and chickens all needed shelter and food. Animals were often kept indoors, either in barns or even inside cottages, where their body heat helped warm the family. Feeding them was a daily struggle. Stored hay and grain had to be rationed carefully so it would last until spring. Water troughs froze over, and animals had to be led to streams or ponds when possible. Manure also piled up quickly indoors, so mucking out was another regular job. Unpleasant, but necessary. Firewood and fuel without fuel, a family would freeze. Collecting and preparing firewood was one of the most important winter chores. Men and older boys cut wood from local forests, but this was not always legal. Many lords restricted peasants from freely taking timber, so fallen branches, brush and peat were gathered instead. Wood had to be chopped and stacked carefully to keep it dry. Carrying heavy bundles of wood or peat was exhausting, but it was a daily reality. The fire could not be allowed to die out, because starting it again was much harder without matches or lighters. Washing and hygiene bathing was rare in winter. With icy water and limited fuel, most peasants skipped washing except for hands and faces. Clothes too were washed infrequently. Soap was expensive, so lye made from ashes was often used. Laundry days were cold, miserable affairs, with women breaking ice to reach water. Wet clothes froze stiff if not dried by the hearth. As a result, many people simply wore layers until spring. Hygiene was not about comfort, it was about endurance. Social work and community help winter was also a season of shared labor. Neighbors often helped each other with big tasks like butchering animals or repairing barns. Feasts, festivals, and church services broke up the long months and reminded people that they were part of a community. The church calendar shaped the rhythm of winter. Advent and Christmas brought celebrations, while Lent, beginning in late winter, imposed strict fasting. These cycles gave people structure and helped them mark time until spring returned. Children in winter, even children had their share of winter chores. Boys helped fetch wood, feed animals, and carry water. Girls spun thread, mended clothes, and learned cooking skills. Play still happened, especially when snow covered the fields, but work always came first. Stories tell of children sliding on frozen ponds with bones strapped to their feet, an early form of ice skating. Simple games with stones or wooden toys were also common. Winter evenings often ended with storytelling by the fire, a tradition that passed history and legends from one generation to the next. The rhythm of work, if you look closely, you can see how winter shaped the rhythm of peasant life. Summer was about planting and harvesting, autumn about storing and preserving, and winter about maintaining and repairing. Spring would then begin the cycle again. Each season had its work, and winter's work was less about growth and more about survival. To sit idle meant to fall behind. To keep working, even in the dark and cold, meant to stand a chance of making it through to the next harvest. A winter day's end picture, a winter's evening in a peasant cottage. Outside, the wind howls, rattling the shutters. Inside, the hearth glows, casting light across rough wooden beams. A woman spins thread, her spindle whirring softly. A man sharpens a tool by the fire. Children curl up in straw beds, yawning after a day of chores. The smell of ale and pottage lingers in the air. It is not comfort as we would know it. It is not luxury, but it is survival. And for medieval peasants, that was enough. The mental battle of medieval winter. When we talk about medieval winter, we often think only about the physical hardships, the cold, the hunger, the hard labor. But just as important was the mental side. Winter tested not just the body, but also the mind and spirit. With long nights, little light, and endless weeks of repetition, peasants faced a psychological battle. To survive winter meant to survive the darkness in more ways than one. Darkness as a constant, modern people rarely experience true darkness. Even at night, street lamps, glowing screens, and headlights keep the world bright. In the Middle Ages, winter darkness was complete. Once the sun sank, the world outside became nearly invisible. Only the moon and stars lit the fields, and inside, the weak glow of a fire was all that broke the shadows. Darkness shaped daily life. It was feared because people believed evil spirits and demons prowled at night. It was dangerous because thieves, wolves, or wild boars could strike unseen. And it was oppressive because it stretched for 14 or more hours each night in midwinter. Peasants endured this long darkness with prayer, storytelling, and by simply going to bed early. Boredom and restlessness. Imagine being trapped indoors for weeks with little to do. Work continued, yes, but winter work was repetitive and slow. Spinning, mending, sharpening, brewing, none of it was thrilling. For children especially, boredom was real. Games helped, but options were limited. This boredom sometimes turned into restlessness or quarrels. Families lived in close quarters, with little privacy. Tempers could flare. The rhythm of winter tested patience as much as endurance. The fear of hunger. Perhaps the greatest mental weight was hunger. Even if a family had prepared well, there was always the gnawing worry. Would the food last until spring? Each time a sack of grain was opened or a wheel of cheese cut, people knew the store was shrinking. By February, when the cold was still biting but supplies were at their lowest, fear became real. Children asked for more food when there was none to spare. Parents had to ration carefully, choosing between today's meal and tomorrow's survival. That constant anxiety weighed heavily on the mind. Faith and religion gave people strength to face these fears. The medieval calendar was full of holy days and festivals, many of which fell in winter. Advent prepared people for Christmas, which brought joy and feasting. Epiphany in January marked the visit of the Magi, and Candlemas in early February symbolized light returning to the world. These festivals broke the monotony of winter. They reminded peasants that their suffering had meaning, that God had planned the seasons, and that endurance would be rewarded. Priests encouraged faith through sermons, and villagers gathered in church, not only for worship, but also for community support. Superstition and fear of spirits. Alongside faith in God was fear of the supernatural. Winter nights were thought to be haunted by ghosts, witches, and restless spirits. Wolves howling in the distance might be taken as omens. Sudden sickness in the dark months was sometimes blamed on curses or demons. To protect themselves, peasants hung charms above doors, carried crosses, or recited prayers before bed. Fires were kept burning, not only for warmth, but also to ward off evil. In this way, superstition helped people feel a sense of control in a world they could not fully understand. Coping with illness also cast a heavy shadow. Colds, fevers, and lung infections were common in the damp and smoky air of winter cottages. With limited medicine, recovery depended on rest and luck. The mental strain of illness was strong. A sick child meant more work for parents and less chance of survival for the whole family. When disease swept through a village in winter, people could do little except pray, share herbs, and hope. The fear of sickness added to the weight peasants carried in their minds. Storytelling as escape, one of the best coping tools peasants had, was storytelling. Long winter nights around the fire became times for tales of saints, heroes, and ancient legends. Elders shared memories, parents passed down folklore, and children learned moral lessons through fables. Storytelling distracted from hunger and fear. It gave families a sense of belonging and reminded them of their place in history. Even laughter found its way into these evenings, with riddles, jokes, and playful songs breaking the gloom. The role of music also lifted spirits. Simple instruments like pipes, drums, and fiddles were played during festivals or gatherings. Singing, whether of hymns or folk songs, echoed through cottages and taverns. The act of singing together helped people feel less alone in the long winter months. Coping through community winter was not faced alone. Villages were tight-knit, and neighbours often relied on one another. If one family ran low on food, another might share a little grain or a loaf of bread. If illness struck, neighbours helped tend animals or bring water. This cooperation was not just charity. It was survival. A family left to fend entirely on its own was unlikely to make it through the hardest winters. By working together, peasants created a safety net that supported their mental well-being as much as their physical needs. The quiet of winter. Despite the hardships, some found peace in the quiet of winter. Without the rush of harvest or planting, there was more time for reflection. The stillness of snow-covered fields and the silence of long nights gave space for thought. For deeply religious peasants, winter was a time to meditate on God's mysteries and prepare spiritually for the year ahead. The turning point, by late February and early March, the worst was nearly over. The days grew longer, the sun slightly warmer. The mental relief was immense. People could sense change in the air, even if food was still scarce. Hope returned as signs of spring appeared. The psychological battle eased, reminding peasants that endurance had its reward. A winter of the mind in the end. Medieval winter was not only a season of physical struggle, but also a season of the mind. The endless nights, the fear of hunger, the weight of sickness, and the closeness of death all pressed heavily on the spirit. Yet peasants found ways to endure through faith, storytelling, music, and community. Their resilience shows us something timeless. Survival is not only about strength of body, but also about strength of heart. Travel, markets, and trade in the frozen months. When you think of medieval peasants in winter, you might imagine them huddled in their cottages, barely leaving home. That picture is partly true. Most days, people stayed close to their village, but winter did not freeze life completely. Travel, markets, and trade still had to continue, even in the harshest conditions. Roads, carts, and feet carried people and goods across snowy landscapes, making winter journeys both necessary and dangerous. The problem of winter roads in summer. Medieval roads were rough, dusty, and full of ruts. In winter, they turned into icy traps. Rain made them muddy swamps, and snow buried them under deep drifts. Wooden carts sank or slipped. Horses and oxen could lose their footing. Even walking was treacherous. This meant travel slowed to a crawl. A trip that took one day in summer could stretch into several days in winter. For peasants with little food or money, this was a serious risk. Journeys were made only when necessary, not for leisure. Why peasants still travelled? So why bother leaving the village at all? Survival often required it. Families might need to fetch salt from a nearby town, take surplus eggs or wool to market, or bring firewood from distant forests. Rent payments to the lord were still due, even in winter, and sometimes had to be delivered, in person. Church festivals also pulled people from home. Pilgrimages, though rarer in winter, still happened, especially if someone sought healing from a shrine. And of course, emergencies, like sickness, disputes, or running out of food, could push peasants onto the dangerous roads. The winter markets remained the beating heart of local trade. Villages and towns held weekly markets, and winter ones were surprisingly lively. Peasants brought what little they had: wool spun into yarn, eggs from hardy hens, preserved meat, or firewood bundles. In return, they looked for salt, iron tools, or luxury items like honey and cloth. Markets also served as social hubs. News from other towns spread through traders. People learned of distant wars, royal decrees, or famines. For peasants, who rarely left their village, this was often their only glimpse of the wider world. Fairs and winter festivals. In larger towns, winter fairs could brighten the season. These were special events granted by kings or lords, where merchants from far away gathered. At a winter fair, a peasant might see spices from the east, furs from the north, or fine cloth from Italy. Even if they could not afford such luxuries, attending gave peasants a sense of wonder. The fair was both business and entertainment, with music, games, and feasting. For people stuck in darkness for weeks, such events brought a breath of joy. Travel by river and ice. Interestingly, winter sometimes improved travel. Rivers that were muddy and slow in summer could freeze solid, creating natural highways of ice. Sledges slid faster than carts over frozen surfaces. In some parts of northern Europe, Frozen lakes and rivers made trade easier, not harder. Boats could not sail on frozen waters, but sledges and skates filled the gap. In the Low Countries, people skated across canals to reach markets, carrying goods on their backs. For peasants in those regions, ice was not only a danger, but also an opportunity. Hazards of the road still, most journeys were risky. Bandits knew, travelers were vulnerable in winter. Wolves prowled near villages when hunger drove them close. Snowstorms could sweep in suddenly, blinding people and covering paths. A traveler who lost their way in deep snow might not survive the night. To reduce danger, people traveled in groups. A lone peasant with a small pack was an easy target, but a group of villagers, armed with sticks or knives, stood a better chance. Safety in numbers was a rule of winter travel. Inns and shelters. For longer trips, inns and monasteries provided shelter. Inns were simple, often just a large room with straw on the floor, where travelers huddled together for warmth. Food was basic, usually bread, stew, and ale. Monasteries were kinder, offering bread and a place to sleep in exchange for prayer or small donations. These stops could mean the difference between life and death. A traveler caught in the open during a blizzard faced frostbite or worse. But inside an inn, even a smoky fire and rough straw felt like paradise. The role of merchants, while peasants usually traded small goods, professional merchants braved winter roads with larger loads. They moved wool, salt, grain, and fish across regions. Merchants often had guards, carts, and horses, making them better prepared. But even they risked disaster. Merchants caught in storms could lose their cargo, and with it, their fortune. For peasants, merchants were lifelines. They brought goods that villages could not make, such as iron pots, millstones, or wine. Even in winter, trade connected the countryside to the wider world, travel for work. Some peasants traveled in winter for work. A poor man might leave his family to labor as a woodcutter in distant forests, selling timber to towns. Others worked on roads or building projects funded by lords. Winter wages, though small, could mean survival for families back home. This was hard, lonely work. The absence of a father or brother made village life harder, but the money or goods earned were sometimes worth the sacrifice. Mental weight of winter journeys travel added to the mental strain of winter. Setting out on the road meant uncertainty, danger, and exposure to the elements. Many prayed before leaving, asking for protection. Returning safely from a journey was cause for thanksgiving. For children, hearing stories of dangerous trips added to their fear of the outside world. Winter roads were not only physically hard, but they also carried heavy symbolism, a reminder of how small humans were against nature. Endurance through necessity. Despite all dangers, travel and trade never stopped completely. Human needs forced peasants onto the roads. The struggle to fetch food, pay rent, or sell goods outweighed fear. Step by step, cart by cart, they kept the economy alive, even in the frozen months. Winter, the great equalizer. Interestingly, winter roads humbled both peasants and lords. Even nobles in fine cloaks struggled when their horses slipped on ice, or when storms trapped them in villages. Wealth could buy better clothes or sturdier carts, but not freedom from mud, snow, and cold. For a moment, winter made everyone equal, under the same sky. The peasant trudging to market and the merchant crossing a river faced the same frozen wind. The frozen web of survival travel, markets, and trade in medieval winter reveal how interconnected people were. No village, no family, could live in total isolation. Even in the darkest season, goods, news, and people moved along frozen paths. Every journey carried risk, but without it, survival would have been impossible. Winter may have slowed the medieval world, but it never stopped it. Animals in the frozen season, partners in survival. When thinking of medieval winter, it's easy to picture only the people, peasants huddling by their smoky hearths, trudging through snow, or straining under heavy loads. But survival in the frozen months was not just a human story. Animals played a central role in keeping peasants alive. Oxen, horses, cows, sheep, pigs, chickens, goats, and even cats and dogs each had their place in the winter struggle. Without them, daily life would have collapsed. The barn as a lifeline. Animals were kept in barns, sheds, or lean-tos, depending on what the family could build. For wealthier peasants, the barn might be a solid timber structure, roofed with thatch. For poorer families, it could be no more than rough walls of wattle and daub patched with straw. Either way, the barn became almost as important as the house in winter. Keeping animals alive through the cold was a daily challenge. Fodder had to be collected in summer and stored carefully. Every fork of hay, every bundle of straw, every handful of grain mattered. A dead cow in January meant no milk for months, no calf in spring, and no manure for fields. Losing animals in winter often doomed entire families. Oxen and horses, muscle for survival. Oxen were the tractors of medieval Europe. Slow, strong, and steady, they pulled ploughs, wagons, and sledges. In winter, they were less active, but still vital. Without oxen, a peasant family had little chance of preparing fields for spring. Horses were quicker but more expensive to feed. Lords and wealthier peasants kept them for speed, transport, and prestige. In winter, horses were sheltered and fed with the best fodder available. For poorer peasants, even owning a donkey was a blessing. A donkey could carry loads of wood or grain when human backs were too weak. Cows, warmth, milk, and manure cows were, perhaps, the most valuable winter animals. A cow gave milk, butter, and cheese, which provided protein and fat when meat was scarce. In barns, cows also provided warmth. Their large bodies radiated heat, so sharing space with them kept other animals, and sometimes humans, from freezing. Cow manure was another treasure. Spread on fields in spring, it enriched the soil. Without it, crops would fail. Some families even burned dried dung as fuel when wood was short, a smelly but necessary solution. Sheep and goats, wool, milk, and resilience. Sheep were hardy, able to graze on poor grass. Their wool, once sheared and spun, was essential for clothing and blankets. Even in winter, sheep could survive outdoors if given some shelter and a little feed, though deep snow threatened them. Goats were tougher still. Called the poor man's cow, goats gave milk and cheese, ate almost anything, and survived in rough conditions. Families too poor for cattle often relied on goats, who stubbornly resisted hunger and cold better than most other livestock. Pigs. The walking larder pigs were often slaughtered in late autumn, providing meat for winter. But some families kept a few pigs alive, feeding them scraps. These pigs became a living pantry, ready to be butchered in times of need. Pigs did not give milk or wool, but their fat and meat were highly prized. Keeping pigs in winter was risky, as they needed more food than sheep or goats. Still, the reward was enormous. Pork, lard for cooking, and bristles for brushes. Every part of a pig was useful, chickens and eggs. Even in the cold, some chickens laid eggs, though less frequently. Eggs were a miracle of winter protein. Chickens also scratched around the yard, eating scraps and insects. Their small bodies required little space, making them ideal for poor families. A peasant house often had chickens running in and out, sometimes sharing corners of the cottage itself. They were noisy, messy, but invaluable. Dogs and cats. Not all animals were livestock. Dogs guarded homes and flocks, barking at wolves or thieves. They also helped hunters chase rabbits or birds in the snow. Peasant dogs were not pampered pets, but working partners. Cats, meanwhile, earned their keep by hunting mice and rats. In barns stuffed with grain and straw, rodents thrived. Without cats, food supplies could vanish under sharp teeth. Cats were tolerated, sometimes even loved, but mainly respected for their skill as hunters. Feeding the animals. Winter feeding was a constant headache. Every day peasants hauled hay from lofts, chopped turnips or beets, and scattered grain. Water had to be broken free from ice, carried in buckets, and shared among thirsty mouths. If fodder ran low, animals starved. Families sometimes cut branches for goats, or mixed straw with a little grain to stretch supplies. A thin cow in March meant less milk and a weaker calf, so peasants did everything possible to keep animals alive. Human-animal closeness. The bond between humans and animals grew especially strong in winter. Barns were not just places for livestock, but centers of warmth, sound, and even companionship. The lowing of cows, the bleating of sheep, and the clucking of chickens filled the cold silence. Some cottages even shared walls with barns, so animal heat could seep into human living spaces. Families slept within earshot of their cattle, tied by survival to the creatures they fed and cared for. Risks from animals. Of course, living so close brought risks. Disease could spread quickly, both among animals and to humans. Barn air was thick with smoke, manure and fleas. Children sometimes caught fevers from sick animals. Still, most peasants accepted these risks, because without animals, there was no life at all. Symbolism of animals in winter animals also carried symbolic weight. The ox represented patience, the sheep humility, and the pig greed or abundance. Winter made these meanings sharper. A family with strong oxen felt hopeful. One with a fat pig felt secure. One with only chickens lived on the edge of hunger. Religious. Festivals in winter often blessed animals. Priests sprinkled holy water on cattle, asking God to keep them healthy until spring. For peasants, animals were not just beasts, but gifts from above. Shared struggle. The winter struggle was shared by humans and animals alike. Both faced hunger, cold, and exhaustion. A peasant looking into the eyes of a thin cow or a shivering goat saw their own hardship reflected back. In some ways, the fates of families and animals were inseparable. If the animals survived winter, so did the peasants. If they perished, so too might the humans who relied on them, the quiet partnership. In the end, animals were silent partners in medieval survival. They carried loads, gave milk, pulled ploughs, laid eggs, guarded homes, and warmed barns. Their presence made the long months bearable. When the snow melted and fields turned green, both peasants and animals stepped into spring together. Winter had tested their bond, and survival depended on their shared endurance. Animals in the frozen season, partners in survival. When thinking of medieval winter, it's easy to picture only the people, peasants huddling by their smoky hearths, trudging through snow, or straining under heavy loads. But survival in the frozen months was not just a human story. Animals played a central role in keeping peasants alive. Oxen, horses, cows, sheep, pigs, chickens, goats, and even cats and dogs each had their place in the winter struggle. Without them, daily life would have collapsed. The barn as a lifeline. Animals were kept in barns, sheds, or lean-tos, depending on what the family could build. For wealthier peasants, the barn might be a solid timber structure, roofed with thatch. For poorer families, it could be no more than rough walls of wattle and daub, patched with straw. Either way, the barn became almost as important as the house in winter. Keeping animals alive through the cold was a daily challenge. Fodder had to be collected in summer and stored carefully. Every fork of hay, every bundle of straw, every handful of grain mattered. A dead cow in January meant no milk for months, no calf in spring, and no manure for fields. Losing animals in winter often doomed entire families. Oxen and horses. Muscle for survival. Oxen were the tractors of medieval Europe. Slow, strong, and steady, they pulled ploughs, wagons, and sledges. In winter, they were less active, but still vital. Without oxen, a peasant family had little chance of preparing fields for spring. Horses were quicker, but more expensive to feed. Lords and wealthier peasants kept them for speed, transport, and prestige. In winter, horses were sheltered and fed with the best fodder available. For poorer peasants, even owning a donkey was a blessing. A donkey could carry loads of wood or grain when human backs were too weak. Cows, warmth, milk, and manure cows were perhaps the most valuable winter animals. A cow gave milk, butter, and cheese, which provided protein and fat when meat was scarce. In barns, cows also provided warmth. Their large bodies radiated heat, so sharing space with them kept other animals, and sometimes humans, from freezing. Cow manure was another treasure. Spread on fields in spring, it enriched the soil. Without it, crops would fail. Some families even burned dried dung as fuel when wood was short, a smelly but necessary solution. Sheep and goats, wool, milk, and resilience. Sheep were hardy, able to graze on poor grass. Their wool, once sheared and spun, was essential for clothing and blankets. Even in winter, sheep could survive outdoors if given some shelter and a little feed. Though deep snow threatened them, goats were tougher still. Called the poor man's cow, goats gave milk and cheese, ate almost anything, and survived in rough conditions. Families too poor for cattle often relied on goats, who stubbornly resisted hunger and cold better than most other livestock. Pigs. The walking larder pigs were often slaughtered in late autumn, providing meat for winter. But some families kept a few pigs alive, feeding them scraps. These pigs became a living pantry, ready to be butchered in times of need. Pigs did not give milk or wool, but their fat and meat were highly prized. Keeping pigs in winter was risky, as they needed more food than sheep or goats. Still, the reward was enormous: pork, lard for cooking, and bristles for brushes. Every part of a pig was useful. Chickens and eggs. Even in the cold, some chickens laid eggs, though less frequently. Eggs were a miracle of winter protein. Chickens also scratched around the yard, eating scraps and insects. Their small bodies required little space, making them ideal for poor families. A peasant house often had chickens running in and out, sometimes sharing corners of the cottage itself. They were noisy, messy, but invaluable. Dogs and cats. Not all animals were livestock. Dogs guarded homes and flocks, barking at wolves or thieves. They also helped hunters chase rabbits or birds in the snow. Peasant dogs were not pampered pets, but working partners. Cats, meanwhile, earned their keep by hunting mice and rats. In barns stuffed with grain and straw, rodents thrived. Without cats, food supplies could vanish under sharp teeth. Cats were tolerated, sometimes even loved, but mainly respected for their skill as hunters. Feeding the animals. Winter feeding was a constant headache. Every day, peasants hauled hay from lofts, chopped turnips or beets, and scattered grain. Water had to be broken free from ice, carried in buckets, and shared among thirsty mouths. If fodder ran low, animals starved. Families sometimes cut branches for goats, or mixed straw with a little grain to stretch supplies. A thin cow in March meant less milk and a weaker calf, so peasants did everything possible to keep animals alive. Human-animal closeness. The bond between humans and animals grew especially strong in winter. Barns were not just places for livestock, but centers of warmth, sound, and even companionship. The lowing of cows, the bleating of sheep, and the clucking of chickens filled the cold silence. Some cottages even shared walls with barns, so animal, heat could seep into human living spaces. Families slept within earshot of their cattle, tied by survival to the creatures they fed and cared for. Risks from animals. Of course, living so close brought risks. Disease could spread quickly, both among animals and to humans. Barn air was thick with smoke, manure, and fleas. Children sometimes caught fevers from sick animals. Still, most peasants accepted these risks, because without animals there was no life at all. Symbolism of animals in winter animals also carried symbolic weight. The ox represented patience, the sheep humility, and the pig greed or abundance. Winter made these meanings sharper. A family with strong oxen felt hopeful. One with a fat pig felt secure. One with only chickens lived on the edge of hunger. Religious. Festivals in winter often blessed animals. Priests sprinkled holy water on cattle, asking God to keep them healthy until spring. For peasants, animals were not just beasts, but gifts from above. Shared struggle. The winter struggle was shared by humans and animals alike. Both faced hunger, cold, and exhaustion. A peasant looking into the eyes of a thin cow or a shivering goat saw their own hardship reflected back. In some ways, the fates of families and animals were inseparable. If the animals survived winter, so did the peasants. If they perished, so too might the humans who relied on them. The quiet partnership in the end. Animals were silent partners in medieval survival. They carried loads, gave milk, pulled ploughs, laid eggs, guarded homes, and warmed barns. Their presence made the long months bearable. When the snow melted and fields turned green, both peasants and animals stepped into spring together. Winter had tested their bond, and survival depended on their shared endurance. Winter dangers, wolves, bandits, and the risks of cold. When you think of medieval winter, you might imagine peasants huddled inside their cottages, safe from the elements. But safety was not guaranteed. The season carried dangers beyond hunger and sickness. Snow and ice made travel perilous. Wild animals prowled the edges of villages, and desperate people sometimes turned to crime. Survival meant more than keeping warm. It meant staying alert to threats lurking in the dark. Wolves at the edge of the forest, one of the most feared dangers of winter, was the wolf. Wolves were common across medieval Europe, and in winter they became bolder. Hunger drove them closer to human settlements, where they might attack livestock or even people. Imagine the scene. Snow lies deep in the forest. Prey animals are scarce, and a pack of wolves prowls the frozen fields. A lone peasant, carrying firewood, could become their target. The sound of howling at night struck fear into entire villages. To defend against wolves, villagers sometimes built watchfires at the edge of fields or rang bells to scare them away. Dogs were trained to guard sheep and cattle, though they often paid the price with their lives. A single wolf was dangerous, but a pack was terrifying. Tales spread of wolves dragging off children, true or not, and these stories added to winter's atmosphere of dread. Bandits and desperate travelers' animals were not the only threat. Winter also made humans dangerous. Hunger and poverty drove, some to theft or violence. Bandits lurked on lonely roads, waiting for travelers slowed by snow and ice. Peasants who had to journey to market or church faced risks. A man carrying grain or a woman with a basket of eggs could easily be robbed. With fewer people traveling in winter, help was unlikely if trouble struck. Some bandits were outlaws, living in forests year-round. Others were simply peasants pushed to desperation. A failed harvest, a sick cow, or an empty granary could turn a neighbor into a thief. Winter tested not only bodies, but morals, and sometimes survival meant choosing between crime and starvation. Accidents on snow and ice, even without wolves or bandits, winter carried everyday dangers. Snow and ice made roads slippery. A fall while carrying firewood or water could break bones. In a time with no hospitals and little medical knowledge, such injuries could mean death. Frozen rivers were another hazard. Peasants often tried to cross ice to shorten journeys or fetch water. If the ice cracked, a person could plunge into freezing water. Rescue was nearly impossible, and hypothermia would claim them quickly. Children, full of energy, sometimes played on frozen ponds. Their laughter could turn to cries in an instant. For parents already struggling, the loss of a child in winter was a cruel blow. Fires in the hearth. Ironically, the hearth that kept peasants alive could also be dangerous. Chimneys were rare in many cottages, and smoke vented through the roof or a hole in the wall. Sparks could easily set thatch ablaze. A fire in winter was devastating. Snow might slow the flames, but most peasants had little water to spare. A family who lost their cottage faced death from exposure. Neighbors might help, but in a season of scarcity, aid was limited. Even without disaster, smoke itself was harmful. Poor ventilation filled cottages with soot, irritating lungs and eyes. Inhaling smoke day after day weakened health, especially among children and the elderly. Starvation-driven risks. Sometimes the greatest danger was within the family itself. As food grew scarce, tensions rose. Parents faced heartbreaking choices about who ate and who went hungry. Children were sometimes sent out to beg or steal, exposing them to cold and danger. In some cases, people simply collapsed from hunger while working in fields or forests. Winter did not pause for grief. Families had to bury their dead in frozen ground, a task as grim as it was exhausting. Predators of opportunity. Not all dangers were physical. Winter also brought spiritual fears. Peasants believed that demons and evil spirits were more active in long, dark nights. Priests warned of the devil's temptations, while folk tales spoke of witches roaming the snow. These beliefs shaped behavior. A man who fell ill after venturing out at night might be said to have been cursed. A woman who gathered herbs in winter might be accused of witchcraft. Fear of the unseen was as real as fear of wolves. Lords and taxes in winter for peasants. Danger also came from above. Lords expected rents and taxes even in winter. A family struggling to eat might still be forced to hand over grain or livestock. Failure to pay could mean eviction or punishment. This added pressure at the worst possible time. Some peasants tried to hide food from their lord's agents, burying sacks of grain in the snow or forest. If discovered, they faced harsh penalties. In this sense, survival meant navigating both natural dangers and human authority. The courage to face the season. Despite these threats, peasants endured. They built habits of caution, traveling in groups, carrying sticks or tools for defense, and teaching children to stay close to home. Songs, prayers, and charms were whispered against wolves, spirits, and thieves. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the strength to keep moving despite it. A man who crossed the frozen woods with a bundle of firewood knew the risks, yet he went because his family needed warmth. A woman who lit her hearth despite smoke and sparks did so because her children needed food. Survival demanded bravery as well as endurance. Hope beyond the dangers. Each passing week of winter brought small victories. A night without wolf attacks, a journey to market completed safely, a cottage that did not burn, a family that made it, through another cold week without starving. These victories were celebrated quietly, but they mattered. They reminded peasants that the dangers of winter, however great, were not invincible. With faith, community, and stubborn determination, they survived. Winter was not just a season of cold, it was a season of trials. Each danger faced and overcome became part of the peasant's strength, teaching resilience that carried into spring. Winter amusements, songs, games, and stories by the fire. When the cold grew sharp and the nights stretched endlessly, peasants turned to small joys to keep spirits alive. Life in medieval winter was not only about toil and fear, it also carried moments of laughter, music, and storytelling. Inside their smoky cottages, families found ways to fill the dark hours. These amusements did not erase hunger or hardship, but they offered warmth of another kind, the warmth of companionship. Music from simple instruments. Music was one of the easiest ways to lighten winter nights. Even poor peasants often owned a flute carved from wood, a drum stretched with animal skin, or a simple horn. Some sang without instruments, using their voices as the main tool of expression. Children clapped or tapped spoons together, while adults sang folk songs passed down. For generations, these songs spoke of love, loss, battles, and saints. Some were humorous, mocking greedy lords or lazy neighbors. Others were work songs, steady rhythms that once matched the swing of a scythe, now repurposed to drive away gloom. On rare occasions, a traveling minstrel might stop by a village during winter, though travel was difficult. Such visits were treasured. A professional musician could introduce new tunes and tales, bringing excitement to peasants starved of novelty. Games for long nights. Peasants also played games. Some were simple contests of skill. Children rolled nuts across the floor, competing to see whose landed closest to a target. Adults played dice, sometimes carved from bone. though the church frowned on gambling. Wages were small, perhaps a piece of bread or a promise of help with chores. Board games existed too. The game of nine men's Morris was popular, played with small stones on a board scratched into a wooden table. The rules were easy to learn but challenging to master. In this way, peasants found entertainment that required only imagination and a few everyday objects. Even riddles and word games filled the air. One person posed a puzzle and the rest tried to solve it. These mental games sharpened wit and broke the silence of long nights, storytelling around the hearth. Perhaps the most beloved winter amusement was storytelling. When chores were done and the fire burned low, families gathered close while an elder began to speak. Stories carried lessons, warnings, and laughter. Some tales were historical, recounting battles or the lives of kings. Others were moral, teaching children the value of honesty, courage, or faith. Many were simply fantastical, filled with dragons, fairies, or ghosts that lurked in forests and fields. Every village had storytellers, often the oldest members of the community. Their memories preserved local history, tales of past famines, or stories of saints said to have visited the region. Through stories, children learned not just entertainment, but identity, a sense of belonging to a chain of generations. Religious plays and carols religion shaped even winter amusements. Around Christmas, peasants performed small plays about the nativity or sang carols in honor of saints. These were community events, bringing villagers together. Though the plays were simple, often acted with rough costumes and no stage, they offered joy and devotion at once. Carols were particularly powerful. Sung in groups, they turned cold nights into moments of unity. The melodies were easy to learn, and the words carried hope of divine protection during the harsh season. Craft and handiwork as quiet pastime. Entertainment was not always loud or playful. Sometimes it was quiet, even meditative. Winter was a season for crafts. Men carved wood into tools, toys, or decorations. Women spun wool or mended clothes, their hands moving steadily as they chatted. These activities were not merely practical. They also served as amusement, a way to keep the mind occupied while the body remained near the hearth. A well-carved spoon or a brightly dyed thread gave satisfaction and pride, proof that beauty could exist even in hardship. Laughter. Despite hardship, laughter itself was a kind of survival tool. Jokes, pranks, and funny stories helped peasants forget the cold. A child might hide a parent's spoon as a joke, or a man might exaggerate a story about a wolf he almost fought off. These small acts of humor reminded families that even in poverty, joy could still be found. The church sometimes frowned on such levity, urging peasants to remain pious and serious. But ordinary people knew that laughter was as important as prayer for making it through winter. Seasonal traditions, certain amusements tied directly to the season. At the end of the year, villagers celebrated feasts like Christmas and New Year. These were rare times of indulgence, with extra food, music, and dancing. Children often received small gifts, perhaps a carved toy or a piece of fruit. Adults enjoyed drinking ale or mead together. These traditions gave peasants something to look forward to, milestones that marked the slow passage of winter. Even after the feast ended, memories of it sustained people. A story of a joke told at Christmas, or a song sung during a feast could be retold in January or February, carrying warmth into colder months. Amusements as survival tools. It is easy to see these amusements as mere distractions, but they were more than that. They were survival tools. A family that laughed together around the fire endured hunger more easily than one that sat in silence. A child who listened to a story about bravery might face the cold with less fear. These simple joys gave peasants strength to face the next day. In a world where danger, hunger, and cold never truly left, amusement became a shield against despair. The echo of their voices, if you listen closely in your imagination, you can still hear them. The crackle of the hearth, the steady hum of spinning wool, the sudden burst of laughter as a child wins a nut-rolling game, the low voice of an elder weaving a tale while the rest listen, wide-eyed. These sounds filled winter nights in medieval villages. They were not grand or luxurious, but they were deeply human. They remind us that even in the hardest times, people sought and found joy. In the end, the peasants' amusements were proof of resilience. Cold could bite, wolves could prowl, hunger could gnaw. But as long as stories were told and songs were sung, hope remained alive. Winter clothing, layers, wool, and ingenuity. When frost settled over the fields and icy winds cut through villages, clothing became as important as food. Without proper garments, peasants risked illness, frostbite, or even death. Yet unlike wealthy, nobles who wrapped themselves in fine furs and imported silks, common people relied on homemade wool, patched linen, and clever layering. Winter fashion for peasants was not about beauty, it was about survival. The base, rough linen. Most peasants wore a base layer of linen, spun from flax grown in summer fields. Linen shirts and underdresses provided the first barrier against the cold. The fabric was breathable in summer, but in winter it offered little warmth. Still, it was essential. Linen absorbed sweat, keeping the outer wool layers dry. Because making linen was labor-intensive, peasants wore the same undergarments for long stretches of time. Washing was rare in winter, when water was icy and soap scarce. Instead, clothing was shaken out, brushed, or aired by the fire. Wool, the true winter armor, the true shield against winter, was wool. Sheep provided the raw material, and spinning, weaving, and dyeing became year-round tasks for village women. Wool had natural oils that repelled water and trapped heat, making it the perfect fabric for surviving harsh weather. Peasants layered wool tunics over linen. These tunics were thick, sometimes felted for extra warmth. Cloaks were also common, large rectangles of wool fastened with simple wooden or bronze brooches. A good cloak could double as a blanket at night, spread on the bed of straw or wrapped tightly around the body. Furs for the fortunate fur was the warmest material, but it was not equally available to all. Nobles enjoyed fox, sable, or ermine, which gleamed white and soft. Peasants made do with what they could trap or trade. Rabbit, squirrel, or sheepskin lined winter garments when available. A rabbit pelt might be stitched into mittens. A sheepskin might be used for a vest. These items were treasured and repaired endlessly. Even scraps of fur were saved to line hoods or boots. The smell was often strong, but warmth mattered more than elegance. Hoods and headwear covering the head was vital. Heat escapes quickly from the scalp, and medieval peasants knew it. Woolen hoods were popular. They slipped over the head, draped across the shoulders, and sometimes had long tails called liripipes that could be wrapped for extra warmth. Caps made of felted wool or fur were also used. Children often wore simple cloth coifs tied under the chin. These not only protected from the cold, but also kept lice at bay, since shaving the head was a common response to infestations. Hands and feet suffered the most in winter. Gloves existed, but they were rare for peasants. Mittens, made of wool or patched fur, were more common, since a single pocket of warmth for fingers was easier to make than fitted gloves. Feet were wrapped in layers. Linen or wool strips served as socks, changed when damp. Over them, peasants wore leather shoes stuffed with straw for insulation. In deeper snow, boots lined with sheepskin offered more protection. Poorer peasants sometimes went barefoot indoors, saving footwear for outdoor work to prevent wear. Belts and layering tricks. One secret weapon against the cold was the belt. Worn tightly around the waist, it kept tunics close to the body and trapped warmth. Cloaks were also belted to reduce drafts. Peasants understood that trapped air created insulation, so they layered as much as possible. Children were often bundled in hand-me-downs several sizes too big, with sleeves rolled and hems dragging. What mattered was not the fit, but the number of layers between skin and frost. Repairs and resourcefulness clothing was expensive in time and labor, so nothing was wasted. When garments tore, they were patched. When patches wore thin, they were layered again. A cloak might contain pieces of fabric from 3 generations of family members. Old clothes were never thrown away. They became rags, stuffing, or were unraveled for thread. Even a small scrap of wool could be rewoven into mittens. This resourcefulness was not simply frugality. It was survival. Colours of winter clothing. Though nobles wore brilliant blues and reds, peasants' winter clothing was usually duller. Natural wool came in shades of brown, grey, and cream. Simple vegetable dyes could produce muted greens, yellows, or rusty reds. Bright colours were rare, but when they appeared, they stood out against the snow. A child in a faded green tunic, a woman with a cloak edged in red, a man with a hood dyed, brown by walnut husks. These touches of colour broke the monotony of winter landscapes. The weight of survival, wearing multiple layers of wool, fur, and leather, was heavy. Movement became slower, work harder. A peasant trudging through snow in a thick cloak and boots might feel weighed down as though carrying an extra burden. Yet the alternative was freezing. Clothes were not designed for ease or beauty, but for endurance. At night, many peasants slept fully dressed. Removing layers meant losing heat, so tunics, cloaks, and even mittens stayed on. Children huddled together for warmth, while adults lay wrapped in cloaks. Beds of straw and furs added insulation, but clothing itself remained the main shield. Clothing as identity, winter clothing also reflected identity. A man's hood might show his trade or region. A woman's cloak might mark her marital status. Even among peasants, clothing was more than fabric. It told others who you were, how hard you worked, and how much you could provide. In winter, this identity was often muted under layers, but hints remained. A belt with a decorated buckle, a carefully mended cloak, or a hood with dyed edging said something about its wearer's pride. A silent testimony. Imagine walking into a medieval cottage on a winter evening. The air is smoky, the fire burns low. Around it, a family sits, cloaks draped, mittens patched, hoods pulled down. Every garment tells a story. The wool spun by a grandmother, the fur trapped by a father, the linen shirt worn thin by years of use. Clothing was not simply protection, it was a testimony to work, love, and continuity. Every stitch carried memory, every layer was proof of survival against the odds. In the end, medieval winter clothing was not glamorous. It was practical, heavy, and often smelly, but it worked. Wrapped in wool and fur, peasants endured frost, storm, and snow. These humble garments were the true armour of ordinary people, without which villages could not have survived the long medieval winters. Faith in the frost, winter religion, and the medieval church. When winter closed in and the land grew silent under snow, peasants turned more than ever to the church. For them, religion was not only about prayer, it was about survival. Faith gave meaning to hardship, explained suffering, and promised that endurance would be rewarded in the next life. The long cold months were full of feast days, fasts, processions, and rituals that shaped how communities faced the frost together. The church. As a beacon in many villages, the church was the largest and strongest building, made of stone when cottages were built of wood and mud. It stood as a symbol of stability when everything else felt fragile. On winter nights, its bell rang out across frozen fields, calling people to prayer. Inside, the air was cold, but it was warmer than the fields outside, and the flicker of candles gave light when homes were dark. For peasants, stepping into the church in midwinter felt like stepping into another world. The scent of incense, the chants of the priest, and the paintings of saints reminded them that life was more than toil. Feast days in the cold months, winter contained some of the most important religious festivals of the year. Christmas, celebrated in late December, was a joyous break from hardship. Though peasants could not afford great feasts, they shared what they had: bread, cheese, and sometimes a bit of meat saved for the occasion. The church service marked Christ's birth with candles, carols, and processions. Soon after came Epiphany in January, which honored the visit of the Magi. Candlemas in February was another bright moment, when candles were blessed and lit to symbolize Christ as the light of the world. These festivals brought rhythm to the endless cold and gave people reasons to gather, sing, and hope. Fasting in winter. Not all holy days brought celebration. The church calendar demanded fasting too, during Advent before Christmas, and later during Lent. As winter gave way to spring, peasants abstained from meat, dairy, and eggs. These rules shaped what families ate. Meals of pottage became even plainer, often with nothing more than grains, beans, and a splash of oil if available. At first, fasting seemed harsh, but in reality, it often matched the rhythm of scarcity. Livestock were slaughtered before winter to save food, so fresh meat was rare anyway. Eggs were scarce too, since hens laid less in the cold. Thus, fasting rules blended with the natural cycle of hunger, the warmth of ritual beyond food. Rituals gave warmth to the heart. Singing hymns in a stone church echoed like music from heaven. Watching the priest lift the host during Mass reminded peasants of God's presence in their lives. Processions, even in the snow, reminded villagers that they were part of a greater story. The act of lighting candles was especially powerful in winter darkness. Each flame was a symbol of Christ's light pushing back against fear, cold, and death. In some villages, people carried candles home from Candlemas to bless their hearths and guard against evil spirits. Saints and protection. In winter, peasants prayed to saints for protection. Saint Blaise was called upon to heal throats during the season of coughs. Saint Nicholas, long before he became Santa Claus, was honored as a patron of children and the poor. Saint Bridget and Saint Agnes were linked with the hope of spring, fertility, and the return of life. These saints were more than names. Their feast days were marked with small rituals, prayers, and sometimes plays or songs. For peasants struggling through hunger and cold, saints felt like close friends, ready to intercede with God on their behalf. The role of the priest, the village priest, was central during winter. He not only led Mass, but also provided advice, blessings, and sometimes comfort in times of sickness. When illness struck in the cold months, the priest anointed the sick with holy oil and prayed for their recovery. At funerals, he guided souls to heaven, giving families hope that their loved one's suffering was not in vain. Priests also taught endurance. They reminded peasants that Christ himself had suffered, and that patience in hardship would be rewarded in paradise. This teaching gave peasants strength to face hunger, frost, and loss. Processions and blessings. Even in icy weather, processions sometimes took place. Villagers walked together, carrying crosses and banners, singing hymns to ask for protection against storms or illness. Fields were blessed so that crops would return strong in spring. Livestock too were sprinkled with holy water, since losing animals in winter could spell disaster for a family. These rituals turned fear into faith. By blessing their world, peasants felt less powerless against the forces of nature. Confession and conscience. Winter was also a season of reflection. With less farm work, there was more time to think about the soul. Confession became important, as peasants spoke their sins to the priest and received penance. For many, this gave relief not only spiritually, but emotionally. To confess anger, envy, or despair was to let go of a heavy burden. The church taught that suffering in this life could cleanse sins and bring salvation in the next. Though harsh, this belief gave peasants meaning in their struggles. The church as community, perhaps. Most importantly, the church bound the community together. On Sundays and feast days, everyone gathered, young and old, rich and poor. In a time when isolation could mean despair, the church gave company, music, and hope. When the snow fell thick and the nights seemed endless, the sound of a church bell, the flicker of a candle, and the chant of a hymn reminded peasants that they were not alone. They were part of something greater than themselves, part of a story that stretched from Bethlehem to their own frozen village. faith against the frost for peasants, winter religion was not abstract theology. It was survival. Festivals gave joy when food was scarce. Fasts made sense when larders were empty. Saints gave comfort when sickness spread. Rituals gave order when life felt fragile. The church did not take away the cold, but it gave meaning to endurance. In the darkest season, faith was the fire that kept hope alive. Neighbors in the snow, community survival in winter. If there was one truth about surviving a medieval winter, it was this: no one survived it alone. A single peasant family left on its own in the cold season would have struggled to keep warm, keep fed, and keep spirits high. But when neighbors worked together, life became a little more bearable. Medieval villages were not just collections of houses. They were webs of cooperation, where sharing, helping, and relying on each other often meant the difference between survival and starvation. The importance of the villager peasant's cottage was tiny and fragile. Thatch roofs leaked, smoke often filled the room, and food stores were meager. Alone, a family could freeze or starve. But in the village, dozens of families faced the same challenges side by side. Together, they created a safety net. If one family's cow stopped giving milk, another family might share some cheese. If someone's roof collapsed under snow, neighbors helped patch it with straw and mud. Winter made this cooperation even stronger. The harvest season was full of work for each household individually, but winter was about endurance, and endurance required teamwork. Shared labor in winter, heavy tasks, were sometimes done in groups. If wood needed to be hauled from the forest, a few men might go together with sledges or carts. When animals had to be slaughtered, neighbors came to help with butchering, salting, and dividing the meat. Women gathered to spin wool, mend clothes, or weave cloth, turning long evenings into social events as much as work sessions. Children too shared in this cooperative spirit. They played together to stay warm, ran errands between houses, and sometimes carried food or water to older villagers who could not fetch it themselves. Borrowing and lending sharing was not just kindness, it was a kind of informal insurance. A family might lend grain to a neighbor in January, knowing that by March the neighbor would repay them with eggs, wool, or a portion of the spring milk. Tools were passed around as well. A good iron axe or sturdy plough was too expensive for every family, so people borrowed from those who owned them. The idea was simple. Today, you help me. Tomorrow, I help you. Anyone who refused to join in this system of lending and sharing quickly became unpopular. A selfish villager risked not only social shame, but also practical ruin, since neighbors might not help them when trouble came. The role of women in community care women were at the center of much of this cooperation. They exchanged food, gathered herbs, and cared for the sick. In times of shortage, they invented ways to stretch meals, mixing oats with beans, or thickening soups with whatever roots were left in storage. They also nursed children for neighbors, if a mother was ill or had lost her milk. In a way, women acted as the glue that kept the village together during winter. Their knowledge of food preservation, clothing repair, and household management spread across families, making sure that even the poorest households survived the season. Mutual defense against danger winter did not only bring hunger, it also brought threats. Wolves sometimes prowled closer to villages in search of livestock. Bands of thieves might take advantage of the dark months to steal grain or animals. A single family could not defend itself, but a village together could ring bells, raise shouts, and drive off danger. Even the way cottages were arranged in clusters was part of this protection. Houses grouped around a central yard or green gave families quick access to one another when trouble appeared. Storytelling and shared evenings cooperation was not only about food and work, it was also about spirit. Long nights by the fire could feel endless if spent in silence, so neighbors often gathered to share stories. Some were old folk tales about giants, witches, or saints. Others were memories of past winters, or songs passed down through generations. These evenings turned fear into laughter and boredom into community. Children learned local history through tales, while adults reminded each other that hard times had been survived before. Helping the weakest winter hit the weakest hardest. The elderly, the very young, and the sick were at greatest risk. Neighbors often stepped in to help. A widow might receive bread or firewood from nearby families. Orphans might be taken in by another household for the season. Even the poorest tried to give something, perhaps a bowl of thin pottage or a bundle of sticks. There was a strong sense that leaving someone to die weakened the whole community. By protecting the vulnerable, villages strengthened themselves. Community, rituals of sharing. Sometimes this cooperation was formalized in rituals. At midwinter feasts, food was pooled so that even the poorest could enjoy a meal. Some villages had traditions of the poor's loaf, where wealthier households baked extra bread to be handed out at the church door. In hard years, collections of grain were made for those most in need. This was not charity in the modern sense, but rather mutual aid, since those who gave this year might be the ones receiving next year. The village as family for peasants, the village was an extended family. Everyone knew everyone else's struggles and successes. Gossip might be sharp, quarrels might flare, but in winter, survival softened divisions. It was better to mend fences than to freeze behind them. Even the idea of hospitality stretched beyond blood ties. Travelers caught in a snowstorm could expect shelter in a villager's barn or cottage. Refusing hospitality was not only cruel, but dishonorable. For tomorrow you might be the traveler in need. What cooperation meant, it is easy to imagine medieval peasants as lonely, shivering figures fighting against the cold. But in truth, their greatest weapon against winter was not only firewood or salted meat, it was each other. Community was their blanket, their safety net, and their shield. Every loaf shared, every tool borrowed, every story told around a smoky fire built bonds that made survival possible. In a time when life was fragile and nature unforgiving, it was not kings or knights who kept peasants alive in winter, but neighbors who opened their doors. A quiet lesson. There is a quiet lesson in this medieval reality. Survival in the harshest seasons was less about strength and more about cooperation. No one was truly self-sufficient. By leaning on each other, medieval peasants proved that the greatest defense against the cold was warmth of the human kind. Winter sickness and strange cures. Winter was not only a season of hunger and cold, it was also the season of illness. The medieval peasant feared fever and cough more than frostbite, because once sickness entered a household, it often spread to everyone. Without modern doctors or antibiotics, even a small infection could become deadly. The winter breeding ground. Cold months forced people indoors, huddled together in small smoky cottages. Ventilation was poor, air was thick with soot, and floors were muddy. Add to this the fact that families shared their houses with animals like goats, pigs, or chickens, and you have the perfect recipe for disease. Coughs, colds, and fevers traveled quickly. A single sneeze could sweep through a whole family in a few days. For children and the elderly, such illnesses were especially dangerous. Common winter illnesses. Peasants did not know the scientific names, but they recognized patterns. They saw chest fevers, likely pneumonia or bronchitis. Ague, a word used for recurring fevers, sometimes malaria or flu-like illnesses. And consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. Stomach problems were also common in winter. Food spoiled easily, and moldy bread or rotten meat could cause cramps and diarrhea. Water often became dirty when wells froze or livestock stirred up mud. Limited understanding of disease. In the medieval mind, disease was caused by imbalances in the four humours of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one, too little of another, and illness appeared. Winter was linked with excess phlegm, since it was cold and damp. This explained why coughs and runny noses seemed endless during the season. Another explanation was spiritual. Illness might be punishment from God or the result of sin. Some villagers believed witches or evil spirits sent sickness. A child who fell ill quickly might be thought of as elf-shot, struck by unseen forces. Home remedies. Without doctors, peasants turned to herbs, kitchen supplies, and tradition for cures. Garlic was eaten to fight infection. Honey soothed. Sore throats and onions were believed to draw sickness out of the body. Warm wine with spices like ginger or cinnamon was used when available, though this was a luxury mostly for the better off. Poultices of herbs were laid on the chest for coughs, while vinegar or urine was sometimes rubbed on wounds to keep them from festering. Bread soaked in milk might be tied to the throat to treat swelling. Some cures sound stranger to us today. A common charm against fever was to wear a bag of herbs like sage or rosemary around the neck. Others believed hanging a live toad in a small pouch around the neck would draw out illness. The village healer. Most villages had someone known for healing skills. This person might be an older woman with knowledge of herbs, or a man who had traveled and learned remedies elsewhere. She or he was not a doctor in the modern sense, but people trusted them more than distant physicians who were too expensive anyway. These healers used plants like chamomile for stomach pains, mint for headaches, and nettle for cleansing the blood. They also offered prayers, charms, or rituals, blending practical medicine with spiritual comfort. The role of the church for peasants. The church was another place to seek healing. Priests blessed holy water, gave out relics, or organized prayers for the sick. Pilgrimage to a saint's shrine was sometimes attempted, though difficult in winter. Some churches also maintained small hospitals, though these were often more like shelters. Their main goal was to comfort the dying rather than cure the sick. How illness affected survival. A sick family member meant less labor in the household. If the father could not work, firewood might not be cut, or animals might not be fed properly. Illness therefore threatened not just the body, but the household economy. Neighbors sometimes helped, bringing food or caring for animals until recovery. But in years when many were sick, this support was stretched thin. The fear of plague. Though the Great Plague years were not constant, memories of outbreaks haunted villages. Winter sometimes slowed the spread of plague, since fleas were less active in the cold, but when it came, entire villages could be struck down. Even smaller outbreaks of unknown fevers created terror, for no one could predict who would survive. A different view of health. Despite the hardships, peasants also knew small ways to keep healthier. They valued fresh air when possible, warm broths, and plenty of rest. Singing, prayer, and laughter were thought to lift the spirits, which was seen as important for healing. We might laugh at some of their remedies today, but many, like garlic, honey, and chamomile, are still valued for their medicinal properties. Even the belief in community care was a kind of medicine, for comfort and kindness helped people endure illness, even if it did not cure them. Endurance in the face of sickness. What is remarkable is not how many peasants died from illness, but how many survived despite poor conditions. Families patched themselves up with herbs and faith, endured weeks of coughs, and returned to the fields when spring came. For them, sickness was simply part of life. They accepted it with a mixture of fear, patience, and hope. Each winter was another test, and survival was proof of both resilience and the strength of their community. A quiet lesson. Illness in medieval winter reminds us of two things. First, that health was fragile without modern medicine. Second, that people met this fragility with creativity and care. The cures might not always have worked, but the effort showed determination to live, even in the harshest conditions. Peasants did not just fight cold and hunger, they fought invisible enemies in their own bodies. And yet, through herbs, prayers, and neighborly support, many pulled through until the thaw of spring. Winter games and small joys. When we imagine medieval winter, it is easy to picture only misery, cold huts, sickly families, and endless hunger. Yet peasants were not only survivors, they were also human beings who craved joy, laughter, and moments of escape from hardship. Winter was long, but it was also the time for rest, gatherings, and simple entertainments. Winter as a season of pause, unlike summer and autumn. When farm work filled every day, winter offered more free time. Snow and frozen. Fields slowed agricultural tasks. Livestock still needed feeding, and firewood needed chopping, but peasants finally had hours that were not consumed by ploughing or harvesting. This pause allowed for storytelling, singing, and games. Though survival was always the priority, peasants understood that joy was another form of survival. Storytelling by the fire. One of the most important entertainments of winter was storytelling. Families gathered around the hearth, listening to tales of saints, ghosts, or distant lands. Parents passed down folk tales, while wandering travelers added strange new stories. These stories served many purposes. Some taught moral lessons, others explained natural events, and many were simply funny or frightening to keep listeners awake. A story about a farmer outsmarting the devil was as popular as one about a knight rescuing a maiden. Songs and music filled long winter nights. Simple instruments like flutes, fiddles, or drums were used when available, but even clapping hands or stomping feet could keep rhythm. Songs ranged from religious hymns to humorous ballads about love, drink, or animals. Children learned rhymes and chants, while adults sang work songs or carols. Singing was not only entertainment, it was also a way of keeping warm. A lively round of music in a crowded cottage could lift spirits and chase away the gloom of dark nights. Games for children and adults. Games helped pass the time too. Children played with carved wooden toys, balls made of stitched leather or simple. Games like tag when the weather allowed outdoor play. In the snow, they built figures, slid on frozen ponds, or threw snowballs, much like children today. Adults enjoyed games of chance, like dice or knucklebones, played with animal bones. Cards were rare for peasants, but guessing games, riddles, and contests of wit were popular. Wrestling or mock duels were also ways for young men to show strength when farm labor was lighter. Winter feasts and holy days. The church calendar ensured that winter was not all bleakness. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas provided excuses for celebration. These festivals brought not just prayer, but also food, drink, and entertainment. On such days, villagers might roast a pig, share ale, and dance together. Mummers' plays, in which villagers acted out comic or heroic scenes in costume, entertained both children and adults. Even the poorest households tried to prepare something special, like a loaf of sweet bread or a spiced drink, for these occasions. Community. Gatherings winter strengthened community bonds. With less fieldwork, neighbors visited more often. Shared meals, communal singing, and collective games turned the dark season into a time of social warmth. Sometimes, young people gathered for courting games, where laughter and teasing broke, the ice between future couples. Elders used the season to pass down wisdom, reciting family histories or teaching crafts. Crafts and handiwork leisure was not always idle. Winter was a time to repair tools, weave cloth, carve wood, and make household goods. These tasks were necessary, but they also had a creative side. A young shepherd might carve a flute, or a girl might weave bright patterns into a piece of cloth. Crafting kept hands busy and minds engaged, and the finished objects could bring pride and beauty to an otherwise plain life. Humor as survival, laughter, was another medicine for winter. Jokes, funny tales, and playful teasing kept spirits high. Medieval humor often centered on animals, fools, or bodily functions. A peasant might joke that the pig in the house snored louder than his wife, or that the cow was the only one providing warmth in bed. Humor allowed people to mock their struggles, making hardship more bearable. It was a reminder that even in poverty, laughter was free. Outdoor winter fun. When weather allowed, outdoor games were enjoyed too. In northern regions, sliding on frozen rivers was a pastime, with peasants using bones strapped to shoes as skates. Sledding down hills was another joy, using wooden boards or even flat pieces of bark. Hunting small animals like rabbits or birds was both practical and entertaining. Children helped chase, while adults used simple traps. Balancing joy with hardship. Of course, winter was never easy. Hunger, sickness, and fear of death were always present. But these small joys, songs, stories, games, and gatherings gave peasants the strength to endure. Joy was not separate from survival. It was part of it. By telling stories, laughing, and celebrating holy days, they reminded themselves that life was more than labor and suffering. They found brightness even in the darkest season. The rhythm of life in this way, winter was not only a trial, but also a rhythm of life. The year was divided into seasons of work and rest, sorrow and joy. Just as fields needed time to lie fallow, peasants needed time to laugh, sing, and remember that survival was more than keeping the body alive. It was keeping the spirit alive too. A quiet lesson. When we think of medieval peasants, it is easy to pity them for their hardships, but their ability to find entertainment and community in winter shows resilience. They may not have had theatres or smartphones, but they had firelight, stories, and each other. That was enough to bring joy into their lives, even when snow fell outside and the nights seemed endless. Winter festivals and feasts for peasants, winter was not only about survival, it was also a season of celebration, especially around Christmas and the New Year. When the harvest was in and fieldwork slowed, people finally had a little time to gather, feast, and break from the grind of daily labor. The 12 days of Christmas, the most important holiday was Christmas, which stretched far longer than a single day. The festival lasted 12 days, beginning on December 25th and ending on the January 6th Epiphany. During this time, the rules of life bent a little. Work was lighter, food was shared, and families and neighbors came together for games, songs, and storytelling. Even poor peasants tried to make Christmas special. A pig might be slaughtered to provide meat for the feast, or a goose if one was available. Bread was baked with whatever flour remained, sometimes sweetened with honey. Ale and cider, carefully saved through the autumn, were brought out and shared. Community feasting in villages. People often gathered in a communal hall or even in a barn, with each family contributing something to the meal. Stews simmered over, great cauldrons, bread loaves were stacked high, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. It was a break from the usual winter diet of porridge, dried beans, and salted fish. Music was played on fiddles and simple pipes, while dancers circled the floor. Children joined in games, and old folk told stories about saints, heroes, and even ghosts. In the dark heart of winter, these celebrations brought light and warmth, not just from fires, but from companionship, customs, and traditions. Some customs were playful, even mischievous. In certain places, the Lord of Misrule, usually a peasant chosen at random, led processions and gave silly orders, flipping the usual social order for a brief time, singing carols, mumming plays, and visiting neighbors to beg for food or drink also marked the season. These customs served more than entertainment. They reinforced the sense of community, helped people forget the cold, and reminded everyone that survival was not only about food, but also about spirit. Contrast with everyday life. For much of the year, peasants worked until their backs ached, and ate food so plain it hardly gave enough energy for the fields. During the festivals, however, they enjoyed a taste of abundance. It was not luxury compared to noble feasts, but for people used to hardship, a slice of roasted meat and a mug of ale was enough to feel rich. Winter joy. These celebrations did not erase the struggles of winter. After the feasting ended, hunger, cold, and sickness returned. But for a short while, peasants could laugh, sing, and dance. They reminded themselves that life was not only toil, but also joy, even in the harshest months of the year. Winter for the nobility. While peasants struggled to stay warm in smoky cottages, nobles passed the winter in very different conditions. Castles were not exactly cozy, but compared to a mud hut, they felt like palaces of stone and privilege. Castles. In the cold, despite their size and grandeur, medieval castles were drafty, damp, and difficult to heat. Large halls echoed with the sound of wind rattling through cracks, and tapestries hung on the walls, not only for decoration, but also to block the chill. Huge fireplaces blazed, but the heat only warmed those close to the flames. Nobles sat bundled, in heavy furs, drinking hot spiced wine to fight off the cold. So, even the wealthy shivered, though they certainly endured it with far more luxury than their peasant tenants. Feasting and entertainment. Winter for nobles was a season of leisure and show. With little agricultural work to manage directly, lords turned to feasting. Banquets featured roasted meats, pies, sweet puddings, and strong wines. Food was displayed not just for nourishment, but as a symbol of power and wealth. Entertainers such as jesters, musicians, and minstrels performed in the great hall. Stories of heroic knights accompanied by harp or lute filled long evenings. Hunting dogs dozed by the fires, while lords and ladies laughed at jokes peasants would never dare to make. Hunting and falconry. When the weather allowed, nobles entertained themselves outdoors. Hunting in snow-covered forests was both sport and practice for war. Lords on horseback with packs of hounds pursued deer or boar. Falcons were released into the cold sky to bring down birds. These hunts reinforced social order. Only the nobility had the right to hunt certain animals, so each outing reminded peasants of their place. What was a desperate act of survival for the poor, snaring a rabbit, was an elegant game for the rich. Winter courts. Winter was also a time for politics and ceremony. Kings and powerful lords held courts in their halls, where nobles gathered to pledge loyalty, plan marriages, or discuss disputes. Lavish feasts doubled as political tools, showing strength through abundance. Ladies of the castle spent winter weaving, sewing, and managing households. They oversaw servants, arranged entertainments, and sometimes even handled local disputes when their husbands were away. A sharp contrast. Though nobles had more food, better clothing, and endless entertainments, they still faced the same season. Cold seeped into their stone halls, sickness spread in crowded chambers, and travel was often impossible due to snow. Winter reminded even the highest born that nature cared nothing for wealth or title. Still, compared to peasants, their hardships were softened by luxury. Where a peasant shivered with one log on the fire, a noble drank spiced wine beside a blazing hearth, entertained by song and story. Noble women and winter life. When we think of medieval winter, we often imagine lords feasting in great halls, hunting deer, or warming themselves with goblets of wine. But behind much of that winter comfort stood the work and presence of noble women. Their lives in the cold season reveal a quieter side of castle life, one filled with duty, skill, and resilience. Running the household. A noble woman's most important role was to manage the estate. Winter did not stop that responsibility. While her husband might be out hunting or attending court, she was in charge of making sure supplies lasted until spring. Grain stores had to be rationed carefully, meat salted and preserved, and ale casks monitored so that servants did not drink too freely. She directed the servants and kitchen staff, oversaw the weaving of cloth and mending of garments, and kept the castle's vast household running like a machine. Without her management, a castle could slip into chaos faster than you might expect. Winter clothing and crafts. One of the busiest tasks in winter was the making and repairing of clothing. Noble women, alongside their ladies-in-waiting, spun thread, wove fabrics, and embroidered gowns. While peasants wore simple wool, noble women had access to fine linen, silk, and richly dyed cloth. Yet even luxury fabrics did not guarantee warmth. A drafty stone hall could still chill a lady to the bone. To fight the cold, noble women layered gowns upon gowns, sometimes wearing fur-lined cloaks or hoods. Gloves and slippers were popular, especially when walking across icy stone floors. Entertainment and education. Winter evenings were long, so noble women filled the time with reading, music, and storytelling. Books were rare, but religious texts and romances about chivalric knights were treasured. If a noble woman could read, she might spend evenings by the fire, studying a psalter or reciting prayers aloud. Music was another comfort. Ladies played small harps or lutes, their soft songs filling echoing chambers. They also told stories, passing down legends to younger children gathered near the hearth. Charity and duty winter also reminded noblewomen of their duty to the poor. Christian faith taught that charity was important, and noble ladies often supervised almsgiving. Bread, leftover food, or clothing might be distributed to peasants at the castle gates. This was not only kindness, but also a way to maintain loyalty and good reputation. Quiet power, though women in medieval society were often seen as secondary to men, the winter months highlighted their importance. Noble women held the household together, ensured food lasted, and provided both comfort and order. In many ways, they were the quiet strength that kept a castle from freezing or starving. Winter queens. At the highest level, queens themselves played these roles on a grander scale, managing royal households and overseeing charity across entire kingdoms. Their presence in court shaped politics as much as warmth shaped survival. So while noblemen hunted in snowy forests, noblewomen built the true foundations of survival in winter: food, clothing, and warmth for all within the castle walls. Childhood in the winter months. When we picture medieval children in winter, it is tempting to imagine them running through snowy fields, laughing and carefree. In truth, childhood in the Middle Ages was far from easy, especially during the coldest months. Still, even in hardship, children found ways to learn, play, and survive the long winter season. Work before play for peasant children. Winter meant work. Younger children helped gather firewood, fetch water from frozen wells, and tend to animals in barns. Even a 6-year-old might be sent to carry kindling or shake snow off a thatched roof. Older children learned farming tasks from their parents, preparing tools for spring or repairing fences. Inside the home, girls spun wool with their mothers, learned to mend clothes, and practiced cooking simple meals. Boys practiced using knives, tended livestock, or learned how to patch wooden buckets. Childhood was training for adulthood, and winter was no excuse to rest. Cold homes. The hardest part of winter for children was simply staying warm. Cottages were drafty, with smoke seeping through the rafters and icy air creeping in through cracks. Children slept beside siblings under heaps of rough blankets, sometimes even curling up beside animals for extra heat. Illness was common, from coughs and fevers to frostbite. Many did not survive their early years, which made childhood fragile and precious. Noble children. For the children of nobles, life was easier, though not without challenges. A noble child might study reading, writing, and Latin under a tutor during winter months, since field play was limited. Lessons were held in chilly chambers by firelight, with wax tablets or parchments. Noble boys trained in riding and swordplay, often practicing indoors with wooden weapons. Noble girls learned embroidery, music, and courtly manners. Even in castles, though, the cold was relentless. Fires blazed in great halls, but bedchambers were often freezing, and children slept under piles of furs. Winter games and joy. Despite the cold, children always found ways to play. They carved toys from wood, played dice or simple board games, and sang songs around the fire. When snow covered the fields, some slid down hills on makeshift sleds or threw snowballs. Skating on frozen ponds with sharpened bones strapped to shoes was also a popular winter pastime in parts of Europe. Festivals provided rare joy. During Christmas, children joined in carols, games, and feasts. They watched plays or listened to traveling minstrels. For a short time, they could laugh freely and forget the cold. A season of learning winter was a teacher for medieval children. It taught them endurance, patience, and the skills needed to survive in a hard world. Whether peasant or noble, a child who lived through the winter learned resilience. Though harsh, the season also created moments of warmth. Siblings huddled together, families sharing stories, and children turning hardship into play. Winter for them was both a struggle and a memory to carry into adulthood. The final chill as we close our journey through medieval winter. it is clear that the season shaped every part of life. Cold was more than an inconvenience. It was a force that dictated survival, work, and even culture. For peasants and nobles alike, winter was the great equalizer, reminding everyone that no matter how much land or wealth you had, you could not escape the bite of frost. Peasant struggles. For peasants, winter meant survival mode. Food stores had to last until spring, fires had to be fed with endless bundles of wood, and families squeezed together in smoky cottages, hoping illness would not spread. Children worked alongside their parents, animals were kept close, and every day was a test of patience. The hardships taught endurance, yet they also created strong communities, where neighbors helped one another through the leanest months. Noble comforts. Nobles certainly had more luxuries, with roaring fires, feasts, and fur-lined cloaks. Yet castles were drafty, and noble families were not free from shortages or sickness. They had duties to keep order, to provide charity, and to ensure their households did not crumble under the weight of the cold season. The higher you climbed, in society, the more responsibility winter placed on your shoulders. Shared human experience. What is striking is how winter connected all people. From the poorest peasant to the richest lord, everyone felt the same icy wind and faced the same fear of running out of food. The difference was in resources and preparation, but the underlying struggle remained the same. Medieval winter was a reminder that humanity's greatest challenge has always been nature itself. Small joys. Amid the hardship, there were sparks of joy. Children sliding across frozen ponds, families telling stories by the hearth, villagers gathering for feasts or songs. These moments lit up the long, dark months. The very cold that made life difficult also brought people together, creating memories of laughter in the shadows of struggle. Lessons from the past. Looking back, medieval winter shows us resilience. These people survived with little compared to what we have today. No central heating, no supermarkets, no hot showers waiting at the turn of a tap. Yet they endured, adapting their lives to the rhythm of the seasons. Their world was harsh, but it was also full of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and quiet strength. The final reflection. So if you think winter today is unbearable, with its icy pavements and endless shoveling of snow, remember the medieval families who faced far colder nights with far fewer comforts. They survived by relying on each other, by storing food with care, by telling stories to chase away the darkness, and by simply enduring until spring's first thaw. Winter in the Middle Ages was a season of struggle, but also a season of human spirit. And perhaps in some ways that spirit is not so different from ours today. And so, our journey through the freezing winters of the Middle Ages comes to an end. We have seen how peasants huddled in smoky cottages, how nobles wrapped themselves in furs, and how children found joy even in the snow. Life was never easy, but it was full of resourcefulness, community, and endurance. If you enjoyed drifting through this quiet history, remember there are many more stories waiting, stories of hardship, of survival, and of strange old customs that shaped the past. So, if you would like to hear another boiling history told in this calm and gentle way, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more sleepy history nights your way. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may your winter be warmer than theirs ever was.